John Macgowan, welcome into the weeds. Fantastic to have you on, mate.
Thanks, mate. It's great to be here.
It's really good to have you because you're a bit of an enigma. You're a man who looks, I think, just as much at home as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch as you do in the corridors of power. You're a political operative. You're a bit of a political spook. Tell us, to begin with, how you got interested in politics, how you came to be a, dare I say it, a feared and respected political analyst and consultant in Australia.
Well, I was never really that into politics when I was a kid. I was just mostly into doing drugs and breaking things when I was younger. What got me into it was when I went to university and, you know, you go to O Week and you walk around the stalls and everything. And at the University of Tasmania in, what would it have been, 2001, 2002, the Liberal Party had the hottest girls. So I was straight away attracted to that. That's why I joined. Because the Greens, the Labor Party weren't quite up to the same standard. So I got into it for the complete wrong reasons. I never had much interest in the ideology. I liked hanging around good-looking rich girls. And somehow I ended up getting a job. They offered me a job one day, probably because I was from a poor suburb in Hobart, Glenorchy. Didn't have much to do with any of those people. So they thought, well, a good disposable asset, right? Like you can deploy him and forget about him. And then discovered that I really enjoyed the work.
Yeah, right.
And I've never really enjoyed the Liberal Party's ideology. I never really thought there was much there that I got passionate about fighting for. What I was passionate about for was the actual work that we did. I liked messing with people and the power that you have in those jobs to craft public opinion is incredible. I mean, you can change an entire country's mind with a story in the Daily Telegraph. And that's what attracted me to it.
So that Machiavellian intrigue, the behind the scenes stuff, like it's been said that you're a very effective operator on the right of politics, that you've run dirt units and these types of things. But that's what attracted you to it, like the stuff that people don't see in terms of how the stories get out there, how the narrative's built. And, you know, sometimes you, like in US politics, you have that October surprise. In an election campaign, you have that big drop of something that's a scandal. That intrigue, that intelligence gathering, that really floated your boat.
Oh, yeah. And I think I would have been in my early 20s and someone gave me a book for Christmas one year about Lee Atwater, the Republican strategist who claimed to fame with things like the Willie Horton election in California, where they ran the attack ads about Willie Horton, who was on death row, who was let off by the then governor, stuff like that.
Yep.
Like the dirty tricks campaigns were fantastic. I thought this was fun. It's something you can enjoy yourself doing.
Yeah, right. And you've been attracted to that part of politics. How important is it in politics? Is it everything? I mean, like, is a massive scandal worth, like, how much more is it worth in politics compared to a carefully crafted policy announcement?
Well, I mean, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said it's everything and it can win elections and it can change the world. But, I mean, what we've learned about politics in the last decade is probably that stuff costs more to your society than you actually gain on the political backswing. I did an interview with, I think it was the Australian a few years ago, the Sydney Morning Herald a few years ago, where it was during the state election and they said, you know, it was a expose on what goes on in the dirt units, right? And I think in that I said that, you know, our moral justification for a lot of this stuff is that we create this crucible for candidates. We make it so difficult for people to get elected because if you put your name forward for high office, it's going to be someone like me in the background who's going to go through every single thing you've ever said in your life. We're going to amplify it. We're going to find the most embarrassing things you've ever done, the stupidest things you've ever done, and we're going to try and stop you getting in there. And for a long time, I believed that was a public service, that we were making the system better by culling the weak, if you
Yeah.
But I think what we've learned in the last decade is we weren't really creating a survival of the fittest scenario. What we were doing was creating a survival of the most boring scenario.
Yep.
And that approach to politics has purged out of Australian public life anyone who might have interesting points of view, different points of view, novel points of view, until you get to this point where every single politician looks the same, sounds the same, has the same values, comes from the same background. Because if you don't go for someone like that, someone like me is going to pick that person to pieces and make sure that they can't get in.
And so people who've been on an interesting life journey may not have always, had a great moral compass or done the right thing. They're then excluded from public office because they haven't been this pure as the driven snow, candidate.
And it probably reached its zenith between the 2016 election and the 2019 elections. Were probably two of the worst, where we were nuking guys over the most idiotic things, like someone told a joke on Facebook, and then and this was amidst the backdrop of an election where we had those S44 issues. Like, there were legitimate questions about why some people couldn't run, but we end up taking guys out over bad taste jokes on Facebook. Did that really improve things? I mean, will we see what has happened to the country in the last 6 years? I mean, it absolutely didn't help anyone.
Yeah, so you've culled out interesting people with might have a point of view that's more in touch with common people, and you get these sanitized politicians. But is that flipping around now? Like I think that 2016-19, the Me Too movement, woke politics was really ascendant. But it seems to me that people, if you look at J.D. Vance or Trump himself, people are actually looking for real character, people who they might not necessarily agree with, but at least they're the phrase that's thrown around a lot now is they're authentic.
Exactly.
They're a genuine hillbilly.
But the problem is that we haven't reached that point in Australia. And I don't think we've reached that point for the next election. Like, they certainly have in the US, they certainly have in the UK. I mean, a great indicator recently in Australia was poor old Barnaby Joyce, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone knows Barnaby Joyce likes to drink, and he drinks too much and he falls down the street and starts having a loud conversation with his wife on the phone. He backed down from that.
Yeah.
Right? He didn't, I wanted Barnaby Joyce to stand up and say, fuck you, man, I like to drink, and sometimes the floor is more attractive than being vertical.
Yeah.
But instead he said, oh, well, actually I took some codeine and I have a drinking problem and I'm going to stop drinking for a while.
On the straight and narrow now.
Of all people, to see Barnaby do that, it's kind of said to me that, well, okay, we're not there. We're not up to where the Yanks and the British are and all of the Eurozone.
Yeah.
Where particularly for people on the right, you can kind of stand up and look down the barrel of the camera and say, no, I'm not changing my behaviour. This is my behaviour.
Yeah.
And if you look at Barnaby's a really good example. I mean, you look at the obrium he got over the years online from left-wing people, from Labor, from whoever. His margins just kept going up.
I know, in Tamworth.
Like, you drive around,
through the roof.
You drive around his electorate and people love him.
Yeah.
Right? They love Barnaby Joyce style antics.
It was what was it, the last anecdote I saw from Barnaby? He watched a whole Matildas game and was live tweeting it from the pub in Tamworth, live tweeting it, and it was the replay of a different game.
Yeah, that's the kind of stuff he was known for, right? And the thing is, in there are just gems of genuine authenticity, and he said things about Australian public life and about Australian society that really resonated with people. I think from a policy standpoint, he was always on the right track. I hate Australian political books, but I mean, Weatherboard and Iron is one of the best Australian political books that's ever been written. Yeah, I honestly think.
Oh, this is an outrageous thing to say, but Barnaby Joyce is an intellectual. He's a public intellectual. I'll tell you an anecdote I know about Barnaby is he does his research. He does his, he's out there and he knows his enemy. He's got his own, his worldview. I used to see him up in Bellingen going to the Enviro Eco Socialist bookstore every summer. He'd be on the summer holidays and he would be loading up with all the books on climate change, ecofeminism, like anarcho-syndicalism, the whole thing loading up and then coming back and turning it into weatherboard and iron, and like this just doesn't pass the pub test. And it is an effective communicator.
And, if in a few more years someone like that would really resonate with Australians. But unfortunately, we're just not there yet. Like, I can't see, and you see it from everything they're talking about. Like, I saw Minns do a press conference yesterday or the day before where he was talking about how great it was that we have the best hate speech laws in the world, which everyone else is rejecting now. Everyone else is saying, well, freedom of speech is important. Everyone else is saying that maybe we've gone too far with this stuff. We're not there yet in Australia. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The legacy influence of our mainstream media is really profound. Like, we're probably the last jurisdiction globally where a News Corporation newspaper could still affect the outcome of an election.
Yeah.
I would say right now there is nowhere else in the world, even where they started in the UK or in the US, where they built their political influence over many years. Only in Australia do they still have that level of influence.
Or a publicly funded broadcaster like the ABC.
Exactly.
Still, like, you just wouldn't get anything like that in the States or globally, Germany or anywhere.
The BBC has zero influence on the outcome of a UK election.
Yeah.
I mean, only in Australia do we still have that, like, it still kind of feels like the early 2000s. Like, I often say with our current crop of with both Dutton and Albo, I mean, they're both kind of reactionary in the fact that they just want to go back to 2004. That's all anyone in Australian politics wants right now. They don't understand the modern world. They don't like where the modern world is going. And all they really want is to take it back to 2004, where they were relevant, where they were well respected, where no one questioned them going to the chairman's lounge, and they could just pump enough yarns into the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald and win an election.
Yeah, and like, they weren't terrified of a misstep. One misstep, they're terrified of doing anything and being called out for doing something wrong. And I'm glad you've raised Dutton and Albo, because I wanted to talk to you about, I think, what's a pretty significant policy announcement. 2025, we're heading into the federal election. Dutton's brought back the long lunch.
He's bringing back the lunch.
The tax deductibility for the long lunch.
I'm very pumped about that.
I mean, how stoked are wine bar owners, Coke dealers, fringe benefits tax? It's the 1980s.
Well, okay, let's be clear though. He's not getting rid of fringe benefits tax, which means we can't have cars, we can't have any of the cool stuff, and it's not for alcohol.
Oh no.
Which I mean, most corporates, even, like, you get a black Amex card from an ASX 500 company, you still can't buy liquor on it. But still, 20 grand, particularly, I mean, I'm a small businessman with a turnover.
Is it 20 grand per annum?
It's 20 grand per annum, right? So 20 grand if you're doing below 10 million turnover, like, that's pretty good. Like, that's a decent feed every fortnight.
Yeah.
Right. That's going to, I mean, one of the biggest tragedies out the back of COVID was the Marigold Yumcha restaurant closed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that could have kept Marigold open. So I think it's a pretty good policy. There's been a lot of criticism from it from pointy-headed economists and, people who don't like, businessmen enjoying a nice lunch. I mean, but I'm one of those businessmen. I know I don't look like it. It's not like it's just Silvertails in MJ Bale suits doing this.
No.
There's a lot of Australians.
Well, there's a lot of
turnover
Australians.
under 10 million.
I think there's more small businesses in Newtown, the People's Republic of Newtown, than anywhere else in Australia. So it'll resonate there. It's resonating with me. What else is cutting through? What do you think's going to shape up the federal election? Dutton's got to win 21 seats.
The problem with these guys is literally nothing is cutting through. No. So if you just distill down what their campaigns are right now. So Labor's campaign is everything's fine, nothing to see here. Employment's up, inflation's okay. Like,
we're doing the best we can.
We're just doing the best we can, and it's all going fine. And if you're complaining, you must be stupid and poor. Like, that's Labor's approach, essentially. If you look at Jim Chalmers on Twitter, like, every single one of his posts is saying, well, you may not know this, but actually this obscure economic metric is looking really good for us. Meanwhile, people can't afford like 12 eggs, if you can even like find eggs in a supermarket. Like, what we're seeing play out in Australia right now is kind of what happened in the US with the Democrats, where Kamala spent that entire last campaign talking up their really good employment figures. And it turns out this rubric that we thought was the case for decades, that so long as everyone has a job, everyone will be happy, has been completely upended, likely upended by what happened during COVID. Whereas now people think having a job isn't as important as being able to afford the things I need to be reasonably happy.
And there's more things you need, and they're more expensive.
Yeah.
There's more expectation.
Yeah.
And so,
So we have this weird out of sync campaign from Labor where, well, you should be grateful that we're at full employment while you're paying, I don't know what it is right now. Like I paid fucking $12 for a carton of eggs the other day. So that's their whole campaign, and I don't think it's working. Dutton's campaign, I think, as well as he looks like he's doing right now in some of the polls, and I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the polling methodologies right now, but he is hinging his campaign on not doing anything on immigration, which is, if you're to the right of centre in this country, immigration is the only thing you care about.
Yep.
And Dutton proposed an immigration policy last year, which wasn't perfect for the right through to the far right, but it was an immigration policy. It was a cut of 25%, I think. He's now walked that back so that we're going into the election where Dutton does not have an immigration policy. And then he's got a nuclear policy, which is frankly science fiction. Like he's doing with nuclear exactly what we on the right spent a decade criticizing the left for doing.
Yep.
Which was saying, well, you want to upend our entire economy on a technology that doesn't exist yet?
Yeah.
I mean,
and publicly fund it.
Yeah, and you were there. I mean, you heard all these same arguments from my guys when you were in Parliament, when you were with the Greens even, that, you know, if the battery technology doesn't exist, the capture and storage solutions don't exist, you're kind of putting that solution off into the future. And that was our chief criticism on the shift to renewables. And now Dutton is coming out with a nuclear policy where no one can show me one of these little basketball-sized nuclear reactors that's working anywhere in the world. And he's saying we're going to build 7 of them. He can't figure out how. It's a purely vibes-based policy. I like the idea of it because my experience in campaigns with the Liberals over the years was even if you propose a policy that people might not like, the fact that you're doing something big and transformative, they will like. And we saw that in 2015 with Mike Baird on energy privatisation.
Yeah.
Right? On paper, energy privatisation was political suicide. Everyone hated it. But he was able to go out there and say, and make the case for it and say, well, we need to do something. We need money so we can do all these other things. So we can do Northwest Metro, WestConnex, the Metro. And the only way we're going to be able to do it is privatising the electricity grid. He convinced the entire state of that. And that I was in focus groups seeing rust on Labor voters saying, look, I hate privatisation. I hated this when Morris Yama proposed it. I've hated it the whole time, but I can see the reason why they're doing it. I think maybe that kind of approach is what's persuaded Dutton on nuclear, that he thinks that people will say, well, they're doing something big, and I support doing something big, but I think you just got to have a bit more of a structure around it than just, 7 imaginary reactors, one of which in an area which suffers from frequent earthquakes.
Yeah. Musselbrook, I think it shook literally the weekday announcement. The other one too is Mount. Well, they're doing it at Lithgow, which is like in the Sydney drinking water catchment. So it's sort of open to a pretty big sort of scare campaign. You've got Newcastle, Sydney, downwind of them too. Labor's, they've started flying a few kites on the sort of nuclear scare campaign. But for mine, I still think it's I think the electorate is going, look, we don't really care. It's just not their core issue.
Yeah.
They're just going, electricity, we don't care. We've got to, pay the bills. We've got a car loan, the mobile phone's costing a fortune, cost of living. And I'd like to bring you back to that issue of immigration. Because I don't want to verbal you, but you're a bit of a nationalist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm extremely right wing.
Yeah, you're extremely right wing. I think
I'm
the viewers
just short
need
of the
to
point
know
where you wear the uniform.
That's exactly right. Like you are a proud nationalist. You're pretty right wing, but immigration is a huge issue, and there's a real conundrum in that because I've been doing a lot of talking and about population, we're not having kids. So we've got to bring people in, and they've got to, like, they're people with skills from, Southern Asia or wherever the fuck they're from. We've got to bring people in to keep the economy, the population growing. How, like, there's this tension, and you see it in the States, like, Trump's just about to launch this uncosted deportation of 11 million people. The corporates must hate it. They're going,
they do.
They do. They're going like, hey, we need these people. We need people because they're engineers. They pick cucumbers. They're consumers. So can you be a nationalist, get immigration right, and not be a racist?
Unpack it. I mean, can you do it without being a racist? Absolutely not. Like, there's just no way to do it without racism getting in there. I always say to my contemporaries on the right through to the far right that racism isn't the biggest crime. Xenophobia is the biggest crime. Right? Like, if you're a little bit racist, if you find some aspects of these people's lives disquieting, that's not a huge issue. But not being intellectually curious about other people is the worst sin you can have. Right? I love knowing all 9,000 possible races and their most disgusting admixtures. Like, I like to get my racism as granular as that. I'm an equal opportunity racist. But xenophobia is a bad thing. Like, you should be interested in other cultures, and especially if they're also racist. Like, I mean, Japanese culture is fantastic because they're also incredibly racist. But on the future of immigration, I think people don't understand what these guys, when you say like the business lobby is they're the ones who are really pushing this. I don't think people understand what they're actually trying to do here. And we saw it, if you're on Twitter, you probably saw it in the last couple of weeks where Elon Musk's coming out and he's saying, well, we need these H-1B visas. We need more of these highly skilled people. It's bullshit. It's complete horse shit. And what these people are doing is they know that in the next 5 to 15 years, no more customer service jobs will exist. No mid-tier technical and engineering jobs in IT will exist.
Yep.
No call center jobs will exist.
Finance sector.
Right. They are running a hot knife through the entire, not middle management, but the middle spectrum of large corporations are going to be replaced with AI.
Yep.
Now, if you go all the way back to the mid-1800s, when the very first attempts at automating industry and replacing human workers start, it's a mixed bag in terms of success, right? The only successful automation attempts occurred at the end of the First and Second World Wars, when the majority of factory workers were women, right, who had been put into factories because there weren't enough men to operate them. They were able to be automated because they weren't replacing men, right? You're able to replace foreigners with automation, right, because no one cares about foreigners. So what these guys are trying to do is backload their industries with foreigners that can be replaced with AI. And they give zero shits about the consequences of that for everyone else. So they're going to bring in millions of people from the subcontinent and third world countries every year to work in these jobs that they know full well are going to be replaced. And they're doing it because they know we will deal with it if it's them, right? If you look at what happened to the American automotive industry in the 1990s, automation just never fully took hold. I mean, you see the videos of like the cool like robot arms and stuff in automotive factories. That's in Asia, right? The Americans were never able to fully automate their automotive industry because who worked in the automotive industry? White men in Detroit, in Michigan. So it was impossible to automate them. You had the Teamsters, you had the political consequences, you had the fact that they were the main ones even buying the cars. So there was an economic factor as well. And so the automation never took hold. And so the companies eventually just shut up shop and sent the jobs down to Mexico and to Asia and to India to be automated, right, where it was easy to automate. That's what we're seeing happen right now. If you look at something like the Australian tech sector, it'd be very hard to automate it right now because these people, young white men living in bed sits with a cat and a girlfriend and playing Xbox all day, right? Now, imagine if you took all their jobs away. No more jobs for mid-tier engineers at Atlassian, at Salesforce, and everywhere else, right? You're going to turn a voting cohort on you in an instant, right? It's going to be chaos. But if you replace all those guys with foreign workers on pretty sketchy visa conditions, it's going to be very easy over the next 5 years to just send them on their way and replace them.
It's interesting because you say like immigration is an issue of the right, but it really is, it always has in Australia been an issue of like that when it does resonate in the centre, you saw Howard.
Yeah.
When it does start to resonate in the centre and someone capitalises on it, they can, they can ride that to power. But Dutton's not doing that.
There's always been this approach from the Liberals that to avoid having the discussion about immigration, you kind of let off the smoke bomb of illegal immigration.
Yeah.
So for like the entire time I worked for the Liberal Party, we never talked about immigration. In fact, the only times we talked about immigration was how good it was. We only talked about illegal immigration, about boat people. It was like, and you saw the UK Conservatives do this same approach in the last election. Funnily enough, the same people designed that campaign that designed out all of ours.
Yeah.
It's this kind of old school tactic to get people thinking about something else, think about the real problem. In Australia, we don't have an illegal immigration problem because unless you're going to get here on a rickety boat that you'll probably die in, maybe we get 100, 200 of these guys a year. It's a drop in the ocean.
Just stagger from, the Kimberley coast all the way to Darwin. Those people you want. And by the way,
actually, yeah, exactly.
If you want people, like, look at how productive in our society, especially for the cannabis industry,
Yeah.
the Vietnamese have been.
If
those people survived.
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
they did the B-52 bombing. They survived, Hong Kong refugee camps, a fishing boat across pirate waters, landing on the coast, and now, super productive part of our society.
But they're not. But that's not who have been boosting up the numbers over the last few years. Like if you look at the 1 million migrants we've had, it's international students predominantly.
Yeah.
And people coming over to work these nebulous jobs.
And you think those jobs in the future...
They're not going to exist.
They're not going to exist.
They're just not going to exist.
How are we going to in the future... Like, because I've been doing a deep dive over the Christmas, period, deep dive, reading, like I looked at a couple of videos, basically of Nicholas Eberstad talking about population and how we're going to manage like a post-population growth economy without mass immigration of just sort of anyone.
That's the most important question that you need to ask. Right
Yeah,
now. Because what not the left per se, but what the business lobby does really effectively is if you say, I think the standard position of the hard right nationally right now is 3-year pause. Like if you said to me, run for Prime Minister tomorrow, what would be my cornerstone policy? I would say 3-year pause on immigration, right? The first attack point they're going to hit you is what are you going to do about the recession? Because you'll be hit with a recession straight away. Now, in the United States, in the UK, in all the northern European jurisdictions where this discussion is happening, they're just avoiding it.
Yeah.
Like no one is talking about the economic ramifications. Now, if you want to win the argument, you have to stand up and be honest and say, yeah, we're going to have a recession.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul Keating did this 30 years ago. He said, we have to have this recession, right? So you straight away have to admit there's going to be a recession. Some industries are no longer going to exist. We're going to have to completely upend the way we administer higher education in this country. Because you're not going to have the universities and the level of prestige at those universities that you used to have in a zero international student environment. I mean, some universities may close. You have to be honest about those things. Let them argue about whether or not they should exist, but at least start from the point that if we're going to do something about the future of immigration in the country, some universities are going to close, we are going to go into a recession, and the government's job is to figure out how to navigate that. Yeah,
there's going to be a rationalisation, and also like an assessment of like I think population is going to be one of the biggest issues, over the next couple of generations, where people live and how they live. We can't just expect to, like in Australia, maintain all these micro villages, with 500 people, 300 people, 200 people out in in one context, and then the other is, do we just keep bringing people in and growing everyone in these huge, globally, significant megacities of Sydney and Melbourne? Like, you look at what's happening around the world, like Germany started declining in population for the first time, other than World War II and World War One, in its history last year. With net migration, they lost, I think, 500,000 people last year. Japan's like 800,000 people.
Oh, Japan's going backwards, but Japan's a fascinating case because Japan seems to somehow just stay on the knife's edge. Now, it makes them very vulnerable to existential economic shock, as we saw with the Asian financial crisis and lengthy period of stagnation after COVID. But they've almost got the balance right. The Japanese, I think, have probably got it to the point where they can manage it. I mean, the alternative to the Japanese model is something like the Singaporeans, where you effectively say that, well, we're a trading commune. Like, we don't have a culture of our own, and we're going to bring in all these people to do all our jobs. Now, is that right for Australia? I don't think anyone's going to wear that. So I think we do have to look at being something more like Japan, where we recalibrate our position in the world and say, well, we're not always going to be what are we right now in the G20? I think we're G16.
Yeah.
I think we're 16th biggest economy, and most of that's from resources, right, which isn't going to last forever. So we may need to recalibrate our internal kind of picture of ourselves. So we're not always going to be like that.
Yeah, well, the Japanese are certainly out there. I think they're encouraging people to have sex at least.
Yeah, that's always Shinzo Abe was always really big on that.
Yeah, more sex, more kids. Doesn't seem that the Koreans too. But even Thailand's got a declining population. But they're not countries where they're great when it comes to sort of not being racist. You also sort of look at France. You see the right ascendant in those places on the back of them trying to deal with these issues by bringing in hope of Moroccans or Turks or whatever.
Yeah.
Now we see the blowback. I mean, a place like Russia, declining population. I don't think their immigration policy is going to be very successful. Who's going to move to
Moscow? A really good
Moscow?
example of that, right? It's kind of like the difference between white people and everyone else, right? Like, white people, we are the most racist people alive, but we're also the quietest about it. Right. And you have this phenomenon where so long as we're making money and we're reasonably happy and nothing bad's happening and things are more or less peaceful, white people will deal with anything until a point. And when you get to that point, we elect Hitler. Like, there's no kind of spectrum between, the start and the end of that. A great example I heard recently, I randomly, a few weeks ago, I tweeted something about Saudi Arabia and ended up going viral in Saudi Arabia for a couple of days and got exposed to all these Saudi Arabian political opinions. And I learned this interesting thing about the last decade in Saudi Arabia and all their massive growth is when the Saudi Arabian government started bringing in guest workers, the racist backlash against them happened as soon as they got off the plane. Like, there was no lead-in time. Like, Saudi Arabians started seeing Malaysians and Thais and Vietnamese working at East Timorese, like all through our region. Like, these people were going over to Saudi Arabia working on construction projects. And the second they landed, Saudi Arabians were like, nope, don't like it. We do not like this. It didn't even last that long before they needed to tidy up their guest worker program. Whereas in a country like ours, we don't say anything straight away. We'll kind of say, oh yeah, well, it's good economic growth. Like, we will allow it to kind of roll on for a while. And then it'll just get so bad that we'll massively overreact to it. And I think as bad as things are in the US right now, they're probably dealing with it at exactly the right time. Like, if they let it go on for another 4 years under a Democratic president, who knows what they would have done in 4 years? Like, all the nightmare dystopia scenarios, like women who complain about The Handmaid's Tale, that would have happened in real life. Like, you would have ended up with some insane evangelical racists taking control. And instead, you've got what's going to be a pretty moderate 4 years. You're going to have one bad year of deportations and whatnot, but they'll get their shit together because they got onto it early. My worry in Australia is that we're never going to get onto this, that we have the exact set of circumstances to allow something to roll on for another 3 years, then another 3 years, and it could be 9 years before someone turns around and says, we've got to do something about that. 9 years on our current trajectory is 10 million migrants. What's our population right now? Like 27 million? Mm. So in 9 years' time, there's going to be another 10 million migrants. And what does that look like at that point?
What is the political vehicle for that? Like One Nation. I mean, Pauline.
Well, forget.
I mean,
I really think everyone's got to forget about One Nation. I just don't think One Nation is relevant to the future discussion of the right in Australia at all. I think they're, whatever they were trying to achieve back in the late 1990s, they failed at it. They've achieved nothing. You guys, if I think about the New South Wales Greens, right, the roguest of the rogue, your rogues gallery when I was there was like David Shoebridge, Lee Rhiannon, Maureen Faruqi, you and Kate Fairman, right? Like, you guys achieved stuff that actually mattered for people. You got amendments through on bills. You treated what you were doing reasonably seriously, as zany as you might have been. Pauline Hanson has been in Australian public life now for 30 years. She has achieved nothing.
I can't remember a single thing she's done.
I don't think she's ever got an amendment up. I don't think she's even passed a notice of motion.
I can't even remember like an idea she's had.
I mean, she wore a burqa.
She wore a burqa. That was it.
Right? The cartoons are funny.
The cartoons are funny. But it's just like, sort of just seems to be nepotism.
The problem for us on the right is really simple.
Sacking her latest MP.
Today, I mean, if you think back 20 years ago when I first started coming through politics, like the kind of stereotype of a hardline right-wing nationalist as being a low IQ, low agency derelict from the Central Coast was pretty accurate, actually. Like, those people kind of were like that. All it took was COVID and giving all these reasonably right-wing guys a year and a half to sit around doing nothing except reading obscure old texts like Julius Evola, Aristocracy of the Soul, all that kind of stuff. Bronze Age Mindset came out around that time. All it took was a generation of guys to start reading and getting intellectual about it, and you leave One Nation behind completely. I mean, Pauline Hanson hasn't written a book that she didn't have ghost written about herself. Like, we're so far away from them now. And there's no political party that's capturing that.
What about the Libertarians? I mean, they've rebranded, but, they're always just a bit of a hack, just like Liberal Democrats.
Look, I like them. Don't get me wrong. I do like those guys. But the ultimate problem is Libertarians can't convince anyone that anything they're going to do is going to matter. Like, they've never been able to convince anyone of that. I mean, Libertarians have run as third rails in US elections for 40 years, right? And they get like 1% of the vote. I mean, Libertarians haven't been able to convince anyone of their viewpoint. No one wants it, apart from hardline Libertarians.
You raised US politics, and you think that they've headed off, any sort of rise of nationalism, dare I say fascism in the US with the election of Trump, JD Vance and the like, and everyone was in a panic. I remember 2016. I think I was the only person in politics saying Trump's going to win.
Oh,
easy.
I remember it. I went and stuck a Trump sticker on your door.
I know. I was saying, like, I wasn't backing Trump, but I was going, this guy resonates with angry, fat, white guys who just missed out, didn't get educated. They're just seeing other people talk about all these other issues, and they're divorced, fucked up, feel like they're 42 and feel like they're on the scrap heap. And there are masses of them, and they're motivated. That cohort, has come back. But everyone said Trump, massive disaster, start wars and all the rest. Straight away, we've seen like Trump elected, like Gaza,
ends the war
straight away. Just totally like stares down a run. We've seen like just the Ukraine, and I want to get onto this, de-escalate.
Yeah.
Just massive de-escalation there. But he's like, I saw today his nominee, Tulsi Gabbard.
Yeah.
She's a former Democrat. He's putting her in charge of national intelligence. She's like a 43-year-old brown woman from Hawaii. That's that's pretty remarkable. Like, what's your take on Trump, like draining the swamp, taking on the deep state? Like, is he really going to do it?
I think he will, but like, take it back to something you said at the beginning, right? This idea. I went to the US for the first time in 2015. After our 2015 election, I quit, became a consultant, and I was going for a consulting job at Crosby Textor, and I hadn't got it yet, and I wanted to go on holiday. I hadn't been on a holiday in like 10 years at that point. and I said, I'm going to the US and I've got this like book of people I'm going to meet while I'm over there in 2015, political guys. I'll do a report. I'll tell you guys what the lay of the land is, right? And I went over there in 2015 and I got back and I said, Trump's going to win the next election, 100%. Like, and people laughed at me. They said, there's no way. I think we were even working for Marco Rubio or someone at some point. Like, that's how little they thought of that idea. But once you set foot in the US in 2015, you could feel it.
Yeah.
I was in a town called Pahrump in Nevada with the exact guys you were talking about, the fat white guys. I got a lift from a guy up to a gun range one day. He had a bumper sticker on the back of his car saying "Rapture Ready." Like, and it turned out everyone in this neighborhood he lived in were the people who kept appearing on. Remember that show, Apocalypse Preppers?
Yeah.
Like Doomsday Preppers.
Preppers.
That was where it was filmed.
Oh.
It was filmed in that town because everyone had like a bunker under their house.
Yep.
And these
garage
guys
full of tins and
it's
ammo.
2015, and these guys are saying Donald Trump. That's who we're voting for already. Yep. And I went back and I said, look, there's something going on over there because so many people said that to me. Even when you got to the East Coast, like driving through Philly and Pennsylvania, like people saying, yeah, there's got to be a change. Things are really bad. But no one really clocked it because they just write those people off. But they're not the reason why he won. The reason he won is this phenomenon that we're experiencing here in Australia right now in a small way. It's like elite overproduction, right? So when you have a system to generate elites, academia, business, whatever, but there's not enough jobs for them, there's not enough prestige for them to get. We see it in the media all the time. As the media collapses in on itself, there's not enough jobs for everyone to get enough attention, right? So then you have guys like Chris Smith, Ray Hadley, Alan Jones before he's unbecoming, right? Suddenly there's not enough room for them in the mainstream. So what do? They go off and they start their little side projects where they just get increasingly towards the fringe. Like Steve Bannon is the most perfect example of that. I mean, Bannon was an investment banker. He was a Hollywood guy. He was producing movies at one point. But there just wasn't enough room for him in American civil society to make something of himself. So he goes the other way. Andrew Breitbart, who founded Breitbart News, is another classic example of a guy who, in previous eras of the United States, would have been right there in the establishment. But in the modern establishment, not enough room for him. So you get this elite overproduction. And you can see it right now in Australia with some of the kind of rogue guys that are coming out speaking against government policy on immigration and stuff. Like Matt Barry is a really good example of that.
Yep.
Right? Matt Barry's a really impressive businessman. He would be mentioned in the same breath as Alan Joyce and Twiggy Forrest 10 years ago.
So they move that way. They're sidelined in a way, but they're early adopters of new technology. So they're they're taking up podcasting.
So that's the other part of the Trump revolution. Like in so far as whether or not he can actually pull it off. I mean, maybe he can. I mean, Americans. At the end of the day, what is the American soul? It's a survivalist. You know? Like these people survive the worst things imaginable. I mean, they conquered that entire land, walked across it. I really think...
I just watched American Primeval.
Oh, how good is that?
Oh, man.
Man, that's the best show I've seen on TV in a really long time.
Have you ever read Cormac McCarthy's
Oh, yeah,
The Blood Meridian?
Yeah,
my God.
It had a lot of that.
It did. It was a rip of that.
It made me kind of think that you could film Blood Meridian.
No
you
way.
Could actually make
you could not like film Blood Meridian. There's a scene in Blood Meridian where Comanche, like Death Riders, wearing wedding dresses and covered in shit.
It's one of the greatest books ever made.
Herding wild cattle at these like cowboys, and then riding behind the wild cattle, and they're just
it's a beautiful book.
Oh man, like Blood Meridian. Cormac McCarthy, man, is my favorite author.
Yeah, but American Primeval was so good, and I watched
But it shows the American psyche. They're like, if there's a nuclear war, there are a lot of people in America. If there's a nuclear war, I'm going to make it out. Like, that's what all those shows are about. I can make it.
And it's such an interesting contrast with Australia and a lot of other countries with large Indigenous populations. I watched a documentary, like a little video with the Indigenous advisors on American Primeval, and like how like open they were about, we were brutal. Like we scalped people. Like, and the pride they have in it, like totally different from here.
Well, I didn't know that about scalping though. Scalping was a headhunting thing.
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
about it was the whites went out and scalped,
Yeah.
and then the Navajo or the Ute or the Comanche went,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, if you want to do that, we can do it too.
And because they were at war. And
Yeah.
I watched a fascinating thing about, and one of the things I got really right in American Primeval was how they fought, right? And American Primeval said at that time when they're still using like cap and ball revolvers, right? So
Yep.
it's before the invention of the 45.45 cartridge,
Yep.
which would revolutionize
powder.
the West. They're using powder guns. It's before the invention of repeating rifles. And in that environment, Native Americans dominated them. Because Americans would hide behind tree stumps, hide behind rocks, fire 6 rounds, and then reload with their head down. Native Americans would fire 6 rounds and then get their hatchet and run at you.
Oh my!
And
Imagine trying to reload like a
well, there's
best
a guy coming at you, like it's
naked.
so cool. Like
Oh
it's
my
just
God.
so cool, and it's that whole thing was great that they actually showed it.
Yeah.
It was the same guys who did Flowers of a Killing Moon as well, which is also a really good like exploration of the Americans' relationship with their First Nations people. But yeah,
it's something I'm like. I've raised this again. I raised it last year in the bicentenary of the Legislative Council last year in 2024, which was also the bicentenary of the Wiradjuri Wars, who were a staunch bunch of Australian Aboriginal like tribal resistance, and like it's just not acknowledged how serious a war that was. And I don't like. I'm not doing it. I'm doing it as an intellectual because I just love history, war, and bloodshed, and like that visceral engagement. That's part of our history, and it's just not really acknowledged how serious that war was. At one point out west, there were 500 to 700 Wiradjuri warriors. They were up against a regiment of Redcoats cavalry who were led by Lieutenant Colonel William Stewart, who was the absolute gun in the British. Like he was a troubleshooter where they went, okay, we've got an uprising in the Punjab. Let's send him there. There's trouble in Canada. We're sending him to Uruguay to take on, an uprising there, or just to piss off the Spanish or the Portuguese or someone down there. And then he turns up. They go, oh, we've got a problem. If we want this colony in Sydney to grow, then we've got a big problem out there. And they sent like crack troops.
Yeah.
These are their Green Berets.
it was an honest-to-God war. The entire frontier wars, which don't even really end until the 1930s.
Yeah, that's
were
right.
an honest-to-God war. And to bring it back to politics and the changing, like how, the fringes of politics are kind of changing the culture right now. There is this incredible thing happening online right now on right-wing Twitter where guys are getting super into Indigenous history.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic account called Mungo Manic, and he's an anonymous historian. He actually recently appeared on the Quillette podcast. And still no one really knows who he is. He posts every day these obscure facts about Indigenous history. And of all the people that it resonates with the right wing. And the reason it resonates is because there's this understanding that we've kind of been lied to for so long about Indigenous history, because there was this concerted effort by left-wing academics in Australia in the lead up to bicentenary and beyond to kind of say, well, Indigenous history in Australia they're all one people and they were all like placid grass dwellers that were invaded by the evil white man and destroyed. And they were kind of passive participants in that. But the reality is these are a warlike warrior people who had an incredible history of violence. That certainly resonates with the right. Anthony Roberts was the Shadow Arts Minister many years ago, and one of the coolest things I ever saw, you can probably scam your way into seeing this because you're still an MP, at the Sydney Museum down the road, in their stacks, they have, it's one of the most incredible things you'll ever see with your eyes, these rows of spears
and
those. Shields. Yeah.
I've seen those. Have you seen the sword made out of hardwood? It's about 1.5 meters long. It's like as thick. It's like a a claymore. It's like a massive, thick hardwood sword, but its handle is like about 6 inches. It's designed for holding with one hand.
These were not a peaceful. These were not the Avatar guys. Like, they weren't like living in trees in peace and harmony. Like,
No.
They were not a people you would want to invade without guns.
There's a great book by by a guy called Strello called A Journey to Horseshoe Bend, and it's about a blood feud between two tribes. Maybe I've got that wrong. Clans out in Central Australia in it's like the turn of last century. It's like it's like 1905. Someone from one tribe goes to initiation site when they shouldn't have been there. The other clan says, you've broken law, and they nominate one of their clan to hunt that person down for justice. And so it's a war, and this clan and these group of guys go out after another group of guys for 28 fucking years. It's a true story.
That's the kind of stuff they do.
And they're hunting across Central Australia just on a point of law, and it's this guerrilla war just across the country. I mean, it's a really it's a really interesting part. I think I follow a couple of Twitters. A guy called Sol. I'm getting him on, who's a historian.
I'll send you a list of guys.
I love that.
There's a few of them who and there's one guy, Hugo, who's here in Sydney, who posts a lot about who is Indigenous, and they have the most obscure things you never knew happened.
Yeah.
And the little bits of their culture. I was at ironically enough, we were at the Australian Natives Association, which is a group of white dudes. Had one of them on talking about it. And it was a really interesting exploration about this idea of what is the fundamental difference between Anglo-Saxons and everyone else, right? It's this concept of clandestine violence, right? Everyone has a concept of performative violence. Every culture engages in performative violence, right? We see it, you look at footage of Hamas guys, right? When they shoot down a helicopter and they start yelling and doing battle cries. That's performative violence, right? Where Anglo-Saxons diverge, sometime in the 15th century, we get this idea of clandestine violence, largely because we started having like female kings, right? A male king has to constantly be proving his masculinity through acts of performative violence, right? But when you have a queen, violence doesn't mean that much. So how she controls the country is through clandestine violence. Catherine the Great does the same thing, starts the same trend in Russia. But
what do you mean they start like essentially a secret police?
Instead of your culture being about a performative violent act to keep everyone in line.
Yeah, we're beheading 15 people.
You start, instead of hanging people in the street, you start disappearing people, right? That's one of the signifiers your culture is really advancing quite quickly when you set aside performative violence, which then leads to retributive violence and a cycle of violence. And then you just start putting a black bag over people's head and taking them out. That's when your society really changes. Now, very few cultures get to that point. I mean, the Japanese did, right? The Japanese had a ritualized performative violence, but they also had a tendency to poison people and kidnap people, right? One of the interesting cultures that developed clandestine violence well before you would expect they would is Indigenous Australians, right? They had these traditions of we call it the bone pointing stuff.
Pointing the bone, yeah.
But they also had poisonings. Like they would leave a bone in a rotting kangaroo overnight so it'd absorb all the gross shit. And then they'd sneak into your camp and run it under your armpit. So you'd end up developing an infection that would kill you. No one else developed that at the same time. So there's a case to be made that on some level they were closer to us than any of the other people we colonized, because very few cultures ever got to that point that we were at.
I was speaking to one of Windradine, who was the Aboriginal general chieftain at the time who fought the British back in 1820s. I was speaking to one of his direct descendants, and Uncle Bill Allen, and he was just saying, look, their law, their stories, they knew exactly what was happening, that they were going to have to defend their territory at the point of a spear. They knew it was going to be hard. They used guerrilla tactics, and they just ran up against probably the best army in the world at the time, who'd been at war for 25 years. I mean, William Stewart's a really interesting one because he was actually the one who fought the Gueros in the Peninsular Wars with Wellington with fast-moving cavalry. And that's what they deployed against the Aboriginal people, and then they just spread that out across the country. But look, I want to talk to you about something which you've sort of you've alluded to, and that is societies that disappear people. And I know I know you spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe.
A little bit,
You're a little bit, but you're au fait with what's happening over there. What about what's going to happen in Ukraine?
That's a huge question.
I mean, just first of all, before we get to Ukraine, you've been to Chernobyl.
Yes, I did. Yeah. Actually, I got to run to the bathroom.
Okay, well, you got to take a piss.
Press.
You ready?
Yeah.
So look, John, I want to bring you back to something you just said, which is about where people are disappeared, rendition, black bags, secret police. Nowhere does it better than Russia. Catherine the Great. You're saying that she probably started off. What the fuck what has been happening in Ukraine? What's your take on Ukraine? I mean, the whole thing. You can start with the Rus moving out of Scandinavia if you want. But most importantly, where are we going to go under Trump? Because he's looking to de-escalate, and I really want you to talk about weaponry. Russian. Do the Russians have the edge in missile technology?
Well, it's really so. I mean, you're right from before. I did spend a bit of time there, and I knew probably better than most. In 2022, at least, when Russia announced the invasion, I probably knew more than most people about what was going on in Ukraine. But I was completely wrong. I mean, that weekend, I think the invasion began on a Thursday or something, and I was saying it's going to be over by Monday. Russia will curb stomp Ukraine. They have no hope. And I was completely wrong. Thank God I was wrong, because I have friends there. I'm very sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause, but that's the biggest question you got to understand about that war is why didn't that happen? Because everything we know about total war in the 21st century suggested that Russia was going to win that in the first 48 hours. There was no good reason why the Ukrainians should have been able to.
They had the material. They had the air supremacy.
So that's what they didn't have. And I've spoken to guys since then. I've spoken to not senior Ukrainian commanders, but guys who were involved in the militias down in the Dnipro and down in Crimea, who said that the deciding factor for why Russia was not able to establish air dominance was Ukraine deployed the same strategies against Russia that Serbia had deployed against the United States 20 years earlier. You remember there was a famous case in Serbia where an F-117 Nighthawk stealth bomber was shot down. It was the first one that was ever shot down. And it was shot down by Serbians in the later part of that war using mobile radar systems, right? So what the Eastern Europeans realised, not just Ukraine, but Serbia and everywhere else, Georgia, everywhere else, this could have been a problem. They realised that the stealth aircraft, they're stealthy, they're hard to see. They're not impossible to see. The real element that makes them so dangerous is that they can detect radar. So they're flying along, and not only within the cockpit, but with the support they have, they're constantly being told where radar is. And so they're avoiding radar while they fly. That's the real most important part of the technology.
So I didn't know that. So radar, you don't have radar has a maximal range.
So I think an F-117 flying along had the radar profile of a sparrow or something. It was very small, but you could still see it. And you could still, by hand, lock onto it if you could see it in the sky. And so what the Serbians did was they got their national radar network and made it mobile. So instead of relying on emplaced radar positions, they put these things on the backs of trucks with short-range surface-to-air missile launchers and went hunting. And they'd switch them on and off at random. So the Americans couldn't figure out when the radars would be on and when they'd be off. They were effectively flying blind.
They weren't always on, so they go dark, move.
Yeah, and so that's what the Ukrainians did, because the Ukrainians realized that Russia's dominance was going to come from, they didn't have many of them. I think like the Americans have got like 200 F-22 stealth fighters, but like the Russians only have like 30 of their stealth fighters, and they fly with a bunch of non-stealth fighters as well. They fly in like a fleet. But they figured out that they only had to shoot one of these things down. They only had to threaten to shoot one of these things down, and it was going to mess up Russia's entire invasion plan. So they put their radars mobile, they switched them on, switched them off, they never knew where they were, and it really badly impacted the Russian battle plans because they realized they can't afford to lose one of their stealth aircraft. It was going to send a terrible message to the Americans. They would have to, explain how it crashed, because it was bad when the Americans, when they lost the F-117, they cancelled the F-117 program after it because they were spending billions of dollars to develop a stealth aircraft that it turned out some dude in a Serbian potato farm could shoot down with a radar that fit on the back of a pickup truck.
On a SAM.
Yeah, so that really messed up the Russians' plan to establish air superiority and eventually take Kiev. And without that, it's World War I. They've been fighting World War I over there. When you don't have total air dominance, you can't fly a helicopter any taller than a tree. Their fighter craft, their bombers can't really hit anywhere within about 10 kilometres of the front line. It's effectively reduced it down to World War I. Trenches. And that's the real challenge in terms of how you think about the war. I can't stand these guys online who keep saying that, well, Ukraine shouldn't capitulate, you shouldn't negotiate, you just keep fighting because you win. The cost of that, I mean, you think about the First World War, right? I mean, by the end of that conflict where you just have a meat grinder with 100 yards of land between people, at any point in that, the moral thing to do would have been to stop it. That's effectively where we are in Ukraine.
Yeah, it is a meat grinder,
yeah,
isn't it? And I follow the ISW Institute for the Study of War, and they talk about they have their sort of daily update, and it says geolocated footy or images or tweets or whatever show that Russian forces have made 300-meter gains.
Literally.
And you're going, oh my God. And there's been a major offensive like Bakhmut.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be thousands of movies.
It's a totally different kind of scale of warfare, though. Someone pointed this out to me really early on, someone who'd been over there and been to the front line, said, have you ever noticed when you watch the footage of fighters in combat, he said, do you ever notice you only see 5 guys?
Yeah.
Right, you don't see. It's not like Saving Private Ryan.
No, it's like a foxhole with 5 guys, and the next guys are 500 meters away.
American operators talk about this a lot. They say that's crazy. Like Delta Force guys will say, "Well, we go to village raids in Afghanistan with 10 dudes." Like Americans fought, for 20 years during the global war on terror without ever having another man more than an arm's length away from them. Ukrainians and Russians are fighting this war. 5 guys will get into a Tarago and drive out to a point on the front line and get out and stretch out across 5 kilometres and hold a position. And they have to do that because of the drones.
Yeah, these people say, oh, Ukraine can win. And anyone who's going to de-escalate that war,
it has to be de-escalated. I mean, look, you can talk until the cows come home about how it could continue going. I mean, the Russians have the capacity to just keep doing it.
Yeah.
And we saw that with them in Afghanistan. Russia does have the capacity to just keep fighting an insane war. Ukraine doesn't. No. Ukraine might be able to get better and better technology from the West, but they're still going to run out of people.
And they certainly can't without uplifting the hardware they're using. And we've seen that Biden's heading to the exit door, and then they're approving the use. What was it? I can't remember the missiles that not
the hypersonic missiles.
But the Americans are saying, oh yeah, it's okay now. You can start shooting into Russia,
and then you're running the risk of a potential nuclear conflict.
And
with
you've got Russians with the hypersonic missiles. I was just going like.
So the question then becomes like, how does it end? Like, what's the deal they get at the end?
Yeah,
and to figure out what that is, you kind of have to understand what they've won and lost. So in 2014, Russia invades the Donetsk and Donbass region, which is pretty much an area about the size of Victoria to the west of the bottom end of the Dnipro River.
Yeah, ethnically Russian though, aren't they?
Well, so they were. Well, not so much ethnically Russian, but culturally Russian. Right? I've driven down there, and the street signs are in Russian when you get to that part. Like, they were, for all intents and purposes, speaking Russian, effectively being Russian. They identified with Russia, but they were within Ukraine. So you had a separatist movement, a long-running separatist movement, the fires of which were stoked by Russian intelligence during that period where Russia had their man in Ukraine, Yankovic, who was the subject of the Maidan protests, was eventually forced to flee. So they kind of create that rebellion in 2014. They support it with their own troops who were unbadged. And, it's an interesting quirk that Australia is the reason we even know that, because when they shot down MH, was it 117 or 370? One of the Russians.
117.
117 was the Russian one. We sent the teams in with the Dutch to do the investigation and prove for the first time that what the Ukrainians were calling the little green men, the unbadged Russian soldiers were fighting in 2014, that they were in the Russian chain of command. That was the Russian invasion of Ukraine begins in 2014. No one admitted that at the time. Barack Obama refused to name Russia as the antagonist behind the 2014 invasion. Globally, no one wanted a bar of it.
Yeah.
And you can kind of understand the issue.
Because they'd all been cozying up to Putin.
Well,
exactly. The Olympic, they were still in the G8, or the whole thing, weren't they?
And you can kind of understand the aggressiveness from the Ukrainians because they had a treaty with NATO from 1994. So when the wall comes down, when Ukraine becomes independent, the Soviet Union leaves, I think it was 4,500 nuclear warheads inside Ukrainian territory. Now, they're still under the chain of command of the Soviet, of the Red Army, right? But they're physically inside Ukraine. Now, Ukraine couldn't necessarily have launched them, but they're theirs. They own them. And we had to help them disarm. And any one of these things could have fallen into the wrong hands. You could reverse engineer them or even just create a dirty bomb out of them. Would have been disastrous. So NATO comes to so there was like a period of about 6 months in 1994 where Ukraine is the fourth largest nuclear power in the world, right? And so NATO strikes a deal with them and says, you open up, let us disarm you, let us take these things, and in conjunction with the Russians still had like a few of them on the backs of rail cars and things, said, let's get rid of your nuclear stockpile. Sign up to the Nuclear Deproliferation Treaty. In return, NATO will guarantee your safety from Russian aggression. And that treaty was signed in 94. And Ukraine was essentially operating under this umbrella of, well, if anything happens, NATO will help, until something happened. And it turned out NATO would not help. And that's really where the whole crisis begins. The failure of, and this is where when Trump says things like NATO's got to pay their way and he's really critical of NATO, I think he's completely justified, because in Ukraine at least, NATO's failure to engage with Russia when they invaded Ukraine in 2014 is where the crisis begins. And everything is downstream from there, everything that happened.
Is it bullshit that the Russia was after the Donbass and Luhansk because of the gas? It's usually,
so one theory,
it's usually real estate. Like it's not
one
really,
theory. One theory is they want a gas pipeline from Russia into Crimea. I don't think that's exactly right. I mean, look, there's definitely the annexation of Crimea itself is definitely about having that exit port, but you got to remember that the oligarchy in Ukraine and the oligarchy in Russia, they're like cousins. So even though they weren't all on the same political side prior to 2022, like there was still plenty of room for that to happen. Gazprom was still going to be able to negotiate a way into Mariupol. I think it was a bit bigger than that and was a bit more about Putin's standing with the kind of ideological center of gravity of his government, less so than the business center of gravity. Because I think the business community, well, when we say business community, we mean the oligarchy. They don't like the war. They prefer the war didn't happen. It's bad for business, right? Because right now,
Gazprom, oh my God.
There's no trade happening.
No trade.
Right? Everyone's losing money. So I don't think that was strictly the reason. I mean, he was always able to get gas out the whole time. It just, I mean, theoretically, it makes it easier. Mariupol is a really great asset. I mean, Mariupol is a city the size of Newcastle with 4 times as many coal loaders or ship loaders, right? So it's basically just one big port town. And obviously they'd want that, but I think a lot of it.
Do you reckon Ukraine would cop a peace deal where they don't get Crimea? They lose, what's the river called? Like all the territory they lost.
So the Dnipro River,
the Dnipro
runs
the
north to south
of
right?
that.
So,
but it's basically the front line
right now. So that is essentially the front line. The Russians were never able to successfully cross it. So if you look in the north of the Dnipro, that's where like Kursk and those regions are. And in the south, you've got Donetsk and Donbass. I think the Russians, given where they are right now, if you were to do a peace deal right now, the Russians won't be able to keep those northern regions. And plus, Ukraine are now operating beyond those northern regions in Russia.
Yeah.
So it's best for everyone.
Against North Koreans.
Yeah, if Ukraine gets their original boundaries to the north, I think they've got no hope of getting Donetsk and Donbass back, because even if you cut a peace, even if Russia just unilaterally surrendered, right, you're still going to have a war in Donetsk and Donbass because those guys are not in the Russian chain of command. They're separatists. So you're going to trade one war for another regional war that no one's going to want to help them with. I mean, the main thing that a peace deal should do is a settlement with Donetsk and Donbass. And that's what they should be using to horse trade a peace deal on, because where they landed in 2022, I don't know if you remember when Putin gave his big speech and he explained why he was invading. And he said, oh, well, because there's Nazis and they've assassinated people. I mean, it's widely known in Donetsk and Donbass that a lot of the key separatist commanders were assassinated by Russia because they weren't staunchly enough in favor of the Russian regime. They wanted independence. These guys actually just want to be their own microstate, about the size of Moldova. So I think it's actually about slightly bigger than Moldova. So you would end up with a new country, possibly 2 new countries within the footprint in Ukraine.
Not NATO aligned.
Not NATO aligned, not necessarily Russian aligned, because they've got a very vexed relationship with Russia, because every time a commander showed up who said, well, we want full independence from Ukraine, we want full independence from Russia, we want our own flag or our own people, Russians would have a car bomb outside his house. So there's no guarantee that whatever microstate emerges in that region will necessarily be pro-Russian. They'll obviously be culturally and socially Russian, but politically, then they might be willing to go their own way. So as a bargaining chip for the West, Donetsk and Donbass is very potent, because Putin, I think it was the day after the war was declared, he passed a motion through the Duma to actually recognize them essentially as Russian satellites, right? And he did that unilaterally.
Yeah, brought MPs in.
Yeah. So if you can get an outcome where Donetsk and Donbass are their own country, but they're not Russian, but they're not Ukrainian, I mean, that's just as bad for Russia as it is for Ukraine. I mean, so that's good game theory on that one. And then the only thing that leaves you is the fate of Crimea and the Mariupol and the ocean access. And I mean, how you'd manage that's very vexed. I mean, one option I've seen pros talk about online is do you end up with Mariupol existing kind of like Singapore? Does it become like an independent city state and just levies taxes on everyone? How's it going to work? I mean, that's one option. But I don't see a scenario where Ukraine fully wins and keeps all the territory they had prior to 2014. I just don't think that's going to happen.
But strategic, like economically, it must have been a disaster for Russia. They're selling a lot more gas to India.
Which is that's fascinating on its own.
I know
that's
the
happened
Indian gas oligarchs. But geopolitically, they've now got Finland in NATO. They've had other countries. The gas isn't flowing to the west. They've got Finland. The other Baltic states moving into NATO. I mean, I think it's legit. You can understand why Putin would be saying, "Hey, post 1990, you promised you would never put, ICBMs in Poland and that they've marched across." I want to ask you, who's got the technological edge when it comes to nukes right now?
The Americans. It's unquestionably the Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, the question of whether or not Russia or China could even land one is doubtful. I mean, the Americans have got stuff that we can't even imagine. So I don't buy the whole argument that a nuclear war, a real apocalyptic nuclear war scenario is viable. I mean, the real risk is the use of battlefield nukes. Yeah. One of these, and you get a scenario kind of like what India and Pakistan have every day, where someone hands battlefield control over to a commander who just starts launching them. That's the real risk. I mean, if you read Annie Jacobson's book on nuclear war, that's the scenario she proposes as the trigger for a global nuclear conflict, is that someone just lets one rip over Russian territory and the Russians freak out and fire everything.
Yeah, it's fascinating how I've done a bit of a deep dive on, how close we are actually to nuclear war. And we're insanely close.
Insanely close. Closer than we've ever been.
I know, it's ridiculous. Although there's a great podcast, Dan Carlin, Hardcore History, where he's got the audio. He plays the audio of the Kennedy brothers getting briefed by Curtis LeMay, where Curtis LeMay says, nuke them. He says, Cuban Missile Crisis, nuke Moscow. The Rand Corporation or someone had said, what's the plan? They've been, commissioned to come up with a plan. It was 140 nukes on Moscow. Yeah. That's how we start.
Well, they believed at that time that the Russians couldn't detect them. And that's fascinating because we mentioned going to Chernobyl before. I mean, the coolest part about going to Chernobyl is not Chernobyl. I walked around the Pripyat reactor. I went into the city. I saw the hospital, which is the most radioactive place on Earth. The single coolest part of the tour is what's called the Daiga radar station. So there's this radar station up on a hill in Pripyat, and it's one of the largest man-made structures that's ever been made. It's like a Eiffel Tower turned out flat. This huge mesh that runs along the top of a mountain. And it was so big that its radio signature was you could hear it on ham radio here. It's a thing called the Russian woodpecker. And so back in the heydays of ham radio, you could tune into this frequency and you could hear this tapping on this frequency that was actually the Daiga radar station. It was that big. And Russia had one of them in Ukraine and one of them up in the Urals. And it basically cast a net over all of Russia so they could detect ICBMs. And it was the most strategically important thing in all of the Soviet Union in the 1980s because it was their early warning system for nuclear attack. When you walk
out
around,
of Poland.
Yeah, or anywhere. Yeah. When you walk around Pripyat and you've got your little Geiger counter, it's buzzing all the time, right? When you go up to the Daiga station, it looks like a sand dune, and your Geiger counter doesn't ping because the first thing the Russians
You had your own Geiger counter.
Yeah, we all had to be armed. There's a funny story about the Geiger counters, but we all had to be armed with them. But when you go up to the radar station, there was no sign of radiation, and the whole thing just looks like a sand dune because the first thing the Russians did after the disaster was they got these helicopters and flew up to the radar station and dumped sand on it. So the whole area around it is covered in sand.
Why?
to get rid of the radiation because all the radioactive dust that had come down, they put sand on top of it. And so you got no gamma radiation coming off it. And then this huge radar station is all rusty. It's like,
what, it was like silica or something insulated?
yeah, it insulates it so it doesn't come out. And then they sent dudes up the radar with basically like a bucket and a soap and a sponge to scrub it.
Oh, man.
And so today it's all rusty because they hand washed it. And so the whole thing has no radiation on it. To this day, every other part of Pripyat is covered in radiation. But this radar station, which was operating until like the early 2000s, is completely clean.
I mean, Chernobyl, like I remember it was 1986, wasn't
86,
it?
yeah.
As a kid, like my mum was, anti-nukes, excuse me, and she'd scared the shit out of me because we used to get remember in Tasmania we'd get like the USS Enterprise, or we'd get we'd get the aircraft carriers turn up and the nuclear subs, and she'd say, we're a nuclear target because we got the zinc smelter and a deep water harbour, and I'd be like, what the fuck? Yeah. And I'd watch the day.
Apparently we were. I've actually heard this from my mum was the director of nursing for the emergency department at Hobart Hospital, and apparently we were in Tasmania back in the 70s and 80s. They actually believed that we were a major nuclear target because of the production facilities, because of the harbour. It's a fairly strategic spot as well, Tasmania. I mean, you can whip down there pretty quickly.
Yeah, so I was I think a lot of people back in the 80s paid a lot more attention, height of the Cold War coming to an end. Chernobyl, scared the living shit. Like that footage. Oh, there's that great doc, or it's not a doco, it's like a Netflix.
Oh, the
series.
TV series.
Yeah, TV series, which is fantastic about the ones that blew me away were like the miners they brought.
Oh, that they brought in,
the miners who had to tunnel in and to basically.
But that was one of the fascinating things about going up there, because the tour guides are all Ukrainian. Like prior to, because I was there in 2018, so 3 years before the war properly broke out. The war was going on when I was there, but far away. But that was one of their major tourist businesses. Like people used to come from all over the world to do the Chernobyl tour. Like it wasn't as scary as you'd think it was, because everywhere you went, there was like a bunch of people. Like it was like a tourist trap. Like they're holding up little flags.
Families on tours.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. But one of the fascinating things because that show came out quite a bit after I was there. It was like a couple of years later. But it's kind of like the cultural difference between what you heard when you were there versus like the Western interpretation of it. Like you watch the show and it's like, oh, this senseless loss of life and all these horrible things that happen. Whereas Ukrainians, even though they have a very vexed relationship with the Soviet Union, like they have a totally different approach.
The guys that went in were heroes.
Like the absolute heroes. And actually, like the Ukrainian interpretation of it is right. Those guys literally saved the world.
Yeah.
Like those miners that went underneath to stop the pile from sinking into the water table. They saved millions and millions of lives.
It was going to create an
bomb. It was going to keep going all the way down until it hit the water table and then contaminate with radiation the water table for all of Europe. Like grain being grown in Spain was going to be radioactive because of this.
And just for 400 million years.
And these men sacrificed their lives to stop it. And there's no schadenfreude in the Ukrainian psyche about it. They're like, no, that's the best thing we ever did. Like that's incredible. And they all these people to them are heroes. They do have there is a very common conspiracy theory in Ukraine that the Americans did it.
Really?
Yeah, very frequently mentioned that America sabotaged Chernobyl because of the radar station.
Yeah, right.
And that it was the Americans wanted to take out that entire region. They believe that to this day. I mean,
fantastic. Look, I'm glad you've raised conspiracy theories because nothing rates better than conspiracy theories. And I love them. I know
them all, man.
Well, all right. Well, come on. I want to hear globally, right? Global or intergalactic. What is the bet?
Right now?
Right now. Come on.
Well, I mean, so Ross Coulthart, who's arguably Australia's greatest journalist, did his piece yesterday on the egg. Have you seen the...
I've missed it.
Okay, so...
Fill me in.
when I was growing up in the 90s, Ross Coulthart was just on 60 Minutes talking like, dangerous toys of the Easter show and shit, right?
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden he's the king of UFO news. It's the weirdest thing. I actually got to meet him because he was working at Spotlight, 7 News Spotlight at the same time I was doing that Bruce Lehrman thing last year. And he's just gone out there. He's just abandoned all pretense of Australian journalism brain and has said UFOs are real and I'm going to find out the truth about them. So he got this guy, some ex-Special Forces helicopter pilot, did an interview with him on Newsmax yesterday where he basically says he picked up an egg-shaped UFO with his helicopter and dropped it off. But he's got footage. Like, he's got actual camera footage. You can see the egg on the end of the string. Like, it's... I don't know. Like, I got some views on that stuff, but that stuff is crazy. Like, whatever the hell is going on with UFOs right now before Trump gets inaugurated, I do feel like they're about to admit to something pretty profound.
What about this whole the aliens, whatever, the pan-dimensional beings? Like they're they're like monitoring us. They're like
I actually don't buy it. I actually honestly don't buy it.
Like could they be bothered? Like we would have to be like a coral reef to them or something.
I love
are
the
they
idea
monitoring our like nuclear silos and intervening?
I don't think so. I do not think so at all. I actually don't believe in it. Like, I actually don't believe in aliens. Like, I used to. Like, when I was a kid, it was my favorite thing. Like, I had this huge collection of like UFO magazines and books and stuff. But as I get older and having ended up working with pretty spooky people in my life, I'm now entirely convinced that the Americans just have some pretty spooky shit.
Yeah.
Like, they're probably man-made aircraft that the Americans developed in the wake of the Second World War. I saw something the other day, actually. It was a former CEO of Lockheed Martin.
Stole from the Nazis, for sure.
Well, that's part of the mythology, right?
That
So there's a guy, David Grush, who's the kind of like poster child for the whistleblowers who's come out. And he tells this story that, it all starts in the 1930s with this like object that they recovered from fascist Italy. And the Italians found this thing that was like a UFO or something. And they've gone, let's call the Nazis and said, is this yours? And sent it back. And then the Americans have like gone out of their way to get it. And he says that was the beginning of the whole program that ends up with Roswell, and they've got all these like spacecraft and shit. I don't buy it. I just don't fucking buy it. I think the Americans developed something that is not viable to be mass produced. They've got some capability that so the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, a lot of his papers got released a few years ago. Eldridge, I think his name was. And in it, he actually says, he refers to UFOs not as unidentified flying objects, but he uses the acronym unfunded opportunity.
Oh, really?
And so his explanation was
just Lockheed Martin prototypes.
These are things that we're building, but that we can't afford to make. And one of the best pieces of evidence that that's true is in the assassination of Osama bin Laden, right? Because everyone forgets this. For me, this was the coolest part of the entire thing. When they killed UBL, they used these stealth helicopters that no one's ever seen pictures of. There are no pictures of them anywhere.
Didn't they stack one?
They stacked one. One crashed, right? And they said that out at Area 51, there were only like 2 of these things ever built. It wasn't viable to mass produce them. So they just had 2 stealth helicopters sitting around.
And they just went, hey, this is a big deal.
Yeah, no one knew how to fly them. So the guy flies it into a wall. I mean, if you believe it, if you want to talk conspiracy theories, there's a really great book, one of my favorite. And I use the term deep politics, right? Like, there's conspiracy theories, like QAnon is a conspiracy theory. And then there's like deep politics, stuff that it's conspiratorial, but it's not necessarily a theory because there's enough evidence. Like, there's a really good book by Seymour Hersh called The Assassination of Osama bin Laden, where he proposes an alternative narrative to what happened. That basically the Americans were completely incompetent and the Pakistanis caught him. And the Pakistanis kept him hidden for 10 years until he became too much of a liability, and then they leaked his location to the Americans.
That sounds far more like
and it's a fantastic book. But that had a fair bit of detail about these mysterious stealth helicopters that had never been used, and they just got it into their heads that we'll fly them in, so the Pakistanis don't know we're there, and then one crashed. Like, and you think like if something like that can exist. I mean, I love Eric Weinstein, who appears on a lot of podcasts, and he always makes this point about, during the Manhattan Project, imagine if you were even, say, like a well-regarded physicist who had no idea that the Manhattan Project was happening, and they put you in a car and they drove you out to the Trinity test site and they told you nothing, and then put the glasses on you and you watched the nuclear bomb go off. What would you have thought?
Yeah.
Like, nothing like that was meant to exist on the planet, and yet there it was right in front of you. It is entirely possible.
It's just insane. I think that's it's totally plausible. And if you look at the sort of that's the macro. If you look at the micro, what's happening with technology at the moment, with quantum computing, like they're using qubits as microprocessors, like fractions of a quark as the 1, 0, yes, no, and like literally in the space, like between your fingers, they're building supercomputers at a micro, like, and then they're talking beyond microscopic,
and then they're talking about building like AI off the back of that. The possibility of an artificial generalized intelligence that can see into the future and the past simultaneously is within the reach of humanity.
Yeah,
that's terrifying.
Professor Toby Walsh was telling me, I went up to the AI Institute at UNSW, like the computers are big enough now to build a digital twin of the universe as we know it, and then fuck around with it.
Have you seen one of my favorite TV shows?
Like, what the fuck?
It's good that we get sidetracked on TV, right? One of the best TV shows is Devs. Have you seen this?
No, I missed
so
it.
It's by the guy who recently made Civil War and I think some other stuff. But basically it's a TV show about a tech billionaire, like Elon Musk style guy, who gets obsessed about his daughter dying and wants to see her again. And so he builds a supercomputer model of the entire universe just so he can go back in time to see his daughter. Like, and it's so perfectly made. Like the science behind it is so accurate. Like, holy shit, you could actually do that. Like, we could have a computer where you could just like press a button, rewind, see what you were doing 20 minutes ago, see what you're doing 20 minutes into the future. Like, that's the future of quantum computing.
Yeah, there's these there's these physicists and mathematicians out there saying, like, I think I might be verbaling Toby here, but I think he said, "Oh yeah, that's a long way off." He said probably in like 400 years or something. And I was like, I was like time travel, or like an interesting one is being like teleportation, the whole Star Trek thing.
Yeah,
like,
yeah, you
I'm going to get from here to
do
there,
it,
but theoretically you could teleport yourself from A to B, but A would die and it would be a new version of you,
like
at B.
in The Prestige.
I haven't seen that, but
like, dude, you got to see that. That's a classic. Christopher Nolan.
Or there's two versions of you. So if you're teleporting around, the more you teleport around, the more like fucking me's there are. Like, that is a freak
The stuff
out.
they're doing is insane, and it all just kind of gets downplayed. Like,
I know, like,
modern scientists have become these like, I don't know, like there's zero excitement to it. Like, I was watching a documentary the other day about what's the Nazi's name? You know, the guy who did the
Werner von Braun.
Von Braun, right? And like, you watch the stuff that was on like prime time American television in the late 1950s, early 1960s.
Yeah.
He was doing like prime time TV bits. Like, you'd be watching the news and we're crossing now to Werner von Braun to talk about how rockets work. And the way he would talk about it and the way he got Americans excited about it is so totally different from the way scientists talk today, where it's all just like so insanely boring. They don't want you to be excited about it.
No.
And it's like, as someone who spends most of their life doing PR, basically, as much as I like to dress it up, like, all I really do is sell things to people. The way this is one of my chief criticisms about the left, and particularly like the environmentalist left in Australia, like the failure to sell renewable energy and the science behind it and the exciting opportunities it presents, and to just kind of play it down and make it all seem normal, has done enormous damage.
Yeah.
Compared to where we used to be, where you had like a guy on TV telling you, yeah, we're going to go to the moon.
Beyond
nuclear cars.
Towards 2000.
Yeah.
I used to love that show.
I
with
loved
the men.
that stuff.
Oh my God.
Yeah, remember Beyond 2000. That was one of the best TV shows.
Towards 2000.
Yeah.
When like 2000, you're like, oh, we're marking this off.
And now we don't do that anymore. And like
But I think that there's that what's happening is with technology, it's moving beyond our legitimately our capacity to understand and conceive it without doing like a PhD. I'll tell you something that's fucking crazy. The guy that's running the the super computer, quantum computer, whatever it is, at UNSW, his name's Merlin. And it's in like metaphysics. It's like it is disappearing off into like cat weasel.
That stuff's crazy.
Fucking magic, man.
No one really gets it. Like I've just on a low level on that. I've got a client at the moment who wants to do his product is essentially like an AI replacement for call centers, right? So it's a product you can install it, and instead of someone calling into your business, going on hold, talking to a human in India, getting rerouted back around, it's just a chat bot plugged into their whole network that talks to you, right? The science behind that is incredible. Like, and it already exists. Like, this isn't theoretical stuff. We could do it right now. The only problem is like processing power. So right now, it's not quite, the price point isn't quite there where like, the example we've been using a lot lately is Centrelink, right? Centrelink does 47,000 calls per day. And that's what we're kind of using as a benchmark to say, like, how much is it going to cost for the AI to do 47,000 calls today at a standard where the user won't be able to tell the difference versus how much is it costing to actually run that infrastructure? We're not quite there yet. But by not quite there, I mean like a matter of months.
I did an AI inquiry at Parliament, and it's completely clear that regulators have got no idea. They've got no idea how pervasive it is.
Yeah.
Like there's been like AI is being used in government departments to identify like at-risk children, like to pick up data points to identify at-risk children.
Well,
it's everywhere.
One of the reasons
and as if it's not being deployed in like where they're deciding where to build schools, infrastructure, the rest.
One of the reasons for that, though, is because there's been kind of like two evolutions of it. So there's the evolution of it that gets you ChatGPT and all that technology, so the large language model stuff. But then there's also, if you think back, I don't know, like almost 10 years ago, the buzzword was machine learning, right? And everyone was talking about machine learning and algorithms and stuff like that and self-writing algorithms and things, right? Now, that has been evolving at the same time. So that's what a lot of these government apps are using. And like, I mean, I said something on Twitter the other day, and I was clapping the guys at T Corp and the Future Fund on the back, saying how incredible it is that these guys who don't work for investment banks and don't get massive commissions are able to consistently deliver 4 to 5% returns on these funds, you know, when they get paid like a fraction of what the guys at Goldman Sachs get paid for delivering the same amount. And someone DM'd me and he said, you know, the truth is in a lot of these government investment firms, we're just trading algorithmically. Like there's no one there making decisions.
Yeah.
It's all machine learning in the background. Like, I was like, shit, man, I thought there was actually some fucking dude in an Armani suit like on the phone saying buy, sell. And he's like, nah, not anymore.
Reading
hasn't been for years.
Prospectus.
And that's everywhere. I mean, even in things like election campaigns, like the extent to which a lot of the polling companies use that stuff now, because, I mean, no one picks up their phone anymore, right?
Yeah.
So when you do polling, the reason it used to be so accurate was because we had good data sets and we could get good samples. You can't get good samples anymore.
Like it's just crazy how statistics work.
Yeah.
Like with the election in New South Wales, the upper house, right? When they're counting, they essentially count like a fraction of it, like a couple of percent. And that's within a margin of error of like, it's like 99.9998% correct.
Well,
once they've done this random sampling of 1%, they know what the other 100% is. And so when you think about AI, with marketing and what people want to hear and testing, messages. That's democracy really isn't prepared for someone who's product tested a message with this, virtual cohort that represents their community.
And that's the future.
They've done it 1 billion times in 15 minutes.
And that's the only way to do it now, because no one picks up their phone anymore to actually, like, when I first started working in politics was 2002, 2003, like, I remember seeing the first polls I ever saw, the caveat was always the margin of error was 4%, right? Now, today, the margin of error on a lot of the polls we look at is less than 1%.
Yeah.
So within the space of about 20 years, with no like significant change to the methodology, you're able to get it down that far. The only way to get it down even further in an environment where no one picks up their phone and talks to you is algorithmically. You have to effectively simulate the electorate.
Why don't we just cut to the chase? And
why don't we just get rid of it?
Just ask the bot, ask the app, who wins the election today? Boom.
That could very well end up happening one day.
And save us $100 million.
What's our biggest issue in New South Wales right now, right? We've got the train stuff going on, the train pay negotiations now. One of the most suppressed documents in New South Wales, one of those documents, I mean, you've done how many SO52s over the years, right? There is a document that no one will ever get their hands on.
Give it to me.
Which is the government's safety assessment of the automated metro. Right. And the reason they don't want to give it out is because they don't want people knowing how much safer you are on the metro, which is completely automated, than with a human driver.
Yeah.
Right. If people knew that, they would be up. I mean, how much did it cost to build the metro? Like $4 or $5 billion, right? Imagine having to convert the entire Sydney rail network to be automated. It would cost tens of billions of dollars. No one wants to do that. They don't want you knowing how much better the automation is than people.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the waterfall disaster, what was that, like 1987, 88? I can't remember what it was. But waterfall was caused by driver error, right? The worst ever rail disaster in New South Wales was because the guy had a heart attack because he was too fat and he collapsed onto the dead man's pedal, right? And then you've got a computer that does it all for you. I mean, if the electorate knew how much better it was, they wouldn't get off your case. They'd be saying, when are we getting automated trains?
When are we
I don't want to ride on a human train anymore.
Aircraft, they're flying, like those super tankers, all that sort of stuff. I've
talked to guys, actually in Ukraine, guys who've been involved in the drone program, who do say that it's going to be very hard to replace human pilots. Like, it theoretically, it sounds really good, but there is so much intuition with, like, the way wind hits the craft. You can feel it through the stick. Like, I mean, I don't think you'll ever get to the point for commercial aircraft where you're not going to have a person in the cabin. But whether or not that person just gets to play Candy Crush all day, like, until an emergency happens, like, I think that'll be the thing.
Just on drones and getting back to the Ukraine, like, everyone's watched those fucking terrible videos of, like, some fucking kid, like with a stick, throwing a stick at a grenade on a drone. How far away are we from essentially, like, infantry being unnecessary? Or
well, no, it's going to go the other way. It's going to go the complete other way.
Wow.
Because what's happening is when you've got, like, a drone infested battle space, suddenly that becomes more important because you've got all this jamming technology. You've got, like, that's why when you watch the drone footage, it always looks shit, right? Because they're flying through, often wired in. They've got these, like, thin fiber optic cables to connect them to the base station. Right?
Really, the drone itself?
Yeah, they've had to wire them in because there's so much jamming going on in the atmosphere that it's so the and it's an interesting thing with, like, regarding UFOs, right? Because if you look at the American drone program in between 2001 and 2008, when they brought out Global Hawk, the Predator drone, when the big innovation in drone technology happens, right? You break down what are those drones. I mean, they're aircraft that structurally and mechanically are no different to what they were flying 100 years earlier, right?
Yeah.
The change in technology.
This is like a V2 rocket.
Yeah,
It's just
I mean, the Predator drone has a propeller.
Yeah.
Oh no, actually, the Predator's got a turboprop, but the Global Hawk had a propeller on the back. The drone that won the war in Afghanistan until we lost it. It was a propeller plane, right? Why was the technology so significant? It's the technology in the little bulb at the front that communicates to the satellite, communicates to the ground, right? So the ability to communicate with it in real time, to have a dude in a cabin in Nevada with a joystick flying this thing from across the world, that's the technology that mattered. And if you look at like UFO sightings, that becomes really interesting because it's only in that period you start to see them doing the maneuvers, like doing things that people say, oh, no plane could do that. Yeah, at the same time, the Americans developed the ability to control these things from space. Suddenly you start to see a change in behavior in them. It's clear they're remotely controlled aircraft, right? But what's happened in Ukraine is they've jammed everything. So you can't control them from a satellite. You can't get a signal up. You can only get a signal out by about 3 kilometers, and a guy with a basic cell jammer on his backpack is going to jam it. So the FPV drones, they've just taken to connecting a fiber optic, and they just fly along, and they've got a fiber optic trailing behind them.
fascinating.
Across kilometers. And like some munitions already have that. So there's like TV missiles and things that are already used that when they launch them, they actually have like a wire attached, and they're actually controlling them via a wire. That's how they're doing drones now, because once you start down that path, someone starts to stop you through jamming technology. So you've just got to get, and eventually it just gets to the point where the war's won by, I don't know if you saw that horrible video the other day, like a guy with a knife, right? There was that, the Russian guy and the Ukrainian guy having a knife fight, like, which is being watched by a drone.
Crazy.
Like,
and ultimately, even if your drone has won, so you got to occupy the land.
Yeah, and you got to stand there.
You got to stand there.
And that's the thing. Like the Americans talk about this a lot. Like when Biden says something like, "Oh well, you know, on gun laws, right? Well, I've got F-15s. You've got an AR-15 on the ground. Like who's going to win?" But at the end of the day, every war is won by a dude with a rifle standing on a street corner. You're not going to win territory without that. Doesn't matter how many planes you got, how many drones you got. It's a dude with a gun on the street corner that wins wars. And that's not going to change anytime soon.
And what about, I'd have to ask you about Musk. What's going on in terms of tech? I mean, Elon's putting, like, that unplanned dismantling of his
unplanned emergency dismantling.
An unplanned emergency dismantling. Like, you know, he had a massive stack. But what's happening with Musk and Starlink? You know, there's some conspiracy theories
Starlink's
going.
interesting. Starlink's the only interesting thing he's doing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's sort of like, if you're talking about conspiracy theories and, like, you know, like, I, for one, think, you know, taking the internet to Africa, affordable internet to Africa, great idea. You know, he's deploying tens of thousands of satellites. Starlink's up and going. And if you're talking about like 1950s futurist, everyone being connected by satellites, all the rest, like, is it a good thing?
Forget about going to Mars. The biggest thing he's doing is Starlink, 100%. I've been saying this for a while, and I started saying this in regard to renewable energy investing in climate change, right? There's a lot of ways to become rich, right? There's a lot of different ways you can become extremely wealthy. There's only like 3 ways you can become powerful in the world. Like anyone can have a good idea and sell a product and become a billionaire. There's only really 3 ways to get to true power and influence in the world. One is through central banking and custodial banking, right? And that's closed off. Unless you're born a Rothschild, it's not going to happen. Then you've got resources and energy, right? Which is a pretty moribund sector. And that's why it's the big kind of flashpoint right now, right? Because you've got new money that sees an opportunity to become powerful by switching the energy mix. But then the third way that everyone forgets is telecommunications.
Yeah.
And going back 500 years, that has been the easy mode to wealth, power, and prestige is controlling communications all the way back to, I mean, you know, you read like Crying a Lot 49, right? Like who were the 3 companies that they said controlled the world? There was like the stupid corporation, the Jesuits, and postal service, right? That is how you control things, if you control how people communicate. And Elon Musk is upending that completely, because no matter what happened with the internet, whether it was the Chinese with TikTok or Russia or whatever happened in the world, if you sent an email, it's whipping around the world through a network controlled by the US Department of Defense. That's who controls the original infrastructure that built the internet. And so for the last 50, 60 years, why has the American regime been so powerful? It's because they control every single piece of information we send. It goes through a wire somewhere on the continental United States until now. And Starlink is the first real upheaval of that we've seen since the invention of the internet. Because today you can send an email and it goes to a base station, it goes up and it comes back down, and it doesn't go through the continental United States for the first time. So that's a game changer. That is a massive game changer. And that's why Musk is becoming powerful. It's not because he owns X or because he keeps launching
Is he
rockets.
becoming powerful because, is he cozying up to Trump because he is an existential threat to the deep state and he needs to, to tell...
I think people have got it wrong. I think Trump is cozying up to him. Because I think if he's the guy who's going to control telecommunications for the next 20 years, you're going to cozy up to him.
Yeah.
It's not that he's glomming onto Trump so that he can get approvals for SpaceX and you can have more driverless cars in California and he gets a better tax deal on X. I think that's bullshit.
It's just another...
He now controls a telecommunications network separate to the US government and to all these corporations and all these interests that over the years have kind of become like barnacles on telecommunications. He's just gone past them all.
So it's like satellite TV and the print media in the 80s and 90s. You've got to go and suck up to Rupert. You've got to go in Australia.
Well, that's what he is now.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's what he is. I think if you're looking ahead to the future, I mean, Elon's going to control the internet. Right now, who controls the internet? The US Department of Defense. At the end of the day, they could flick a button and the internet goes down.
Yeah,
at least every server on the continental United States, every route in there via the undersea cables, that's all very old DARPA technology that they're using for the internet. And now Elon Musk has said, well, what if we just have a satellite link?
So it's like the 1860s, you're rolling out the telegraph wire across the continental United States.
Exactly.
No, it's not the state doing it. It's like this individual and massive
This is why I think for the last 5 or 6 years, and this is one of Elon Musk's chief complaints, when he says that he kept facing all these impediments to Starlink from the US regulators, I actually think it was in good faith. I think the regulators were looking at it going, well, do we want one guy controlling the future of the internet? Because as bad as things are now, I mean, at least a liberal democracy controls the internet. At least you can change the president of the United States. You can't change the owner of Starlink, right? And I've always said this about every kind of revolution in technology we've seen, and particularly on things like domestically on climate change, right? We're in a phase in Australia and around the world right now where new billionaires are being picked. And the thing about billionaires is once you create one, you can't uncreate one.
Yeah.
You can't even kill them. Because if they got kids, you're just going to have a younger billionaire, right? If they got 2 kids, you're just going to have 2 billionaires worth half as much. So every time you change a policy that's going to create another billionaire, you have to be thinking 100 years ahead, because that's how long they're going to last.
Yeah.
America's billionaires were created in the Gilded Age are still there now.
Yeah.
Right? The billionaires that were created in Europe in the 17th century are still running banks now. Right? So every time you change a policy that creates a new billionaire, you have to think really, really cautiously about it. I mean, we had a set of policies in the late 1990s that created Gina Rinehart. Now, people critical of Rinehart, but she's largely harmless, right? Now we're talking about a set of policies going to create, 1, 2, 3 new Gina Rineharts? And you have no way of controlling them. You can't get rid of them. I mean, you can't even kill them. So every time you make a policy like this, you have to really think about it and think, how are we going to deal with these people going into the future?
And with Musk, that genie is 100% out of the bottle.
Sorry. He's
he's integrated now into the US telecommunications regime, into US aerospace, into US transport, into social media. Like, I mean, Bezos is worth more, but I mean, Musk is way more influential than Bezos. Like,
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, look, I like the guy. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm always impressed by the stuff he does, and I want to go to Mars. I'll happily be on the first ship there if it can get me out of Sydney. But you should be scared of him. Like, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got when I worked at Crosby Textor, and I was leaving in like 2018, and one of the guys who worked for him was an ex-MI6 guy and had worked there for many years. And I said, he'd consulted as well privately in the past. And I said, do you have any advice if I'm going to go out and consult my own? And he said, number one piece of advice, don't work for anyone worth more than $4 billion. And I said, that's awfully specific. Why is that? And he said, because they can kill you.
Yeah.
He said, that's...
I saw one of your tweets was like, there's rich, which is like, I don't know what the step was, but there was like, there was toilet on your own boat. Rich.
Yeah. Flushing toilet
on your own boat. And then I can just rub out whoever I want.
Yeah.
And
the three stages of rich.
Yeah, the 3 stages of rich.
But there's a point. There's a point where they can do that. Right?
Yeah.
And when you're around them, like I would say in Australia right now, there's probably like one guy like that. You probably never heard of him. He's a resources guy, actually, but not a household name. But very few people, like in our country, we have people like Gina Reinhardt. She's worth about $30 billion. But I mean, what's her liquidity, right? Like how much cash has she got on hand at any one time? Right? There's not actually that many people like that in our country. In America, there's those people like state to state.
Yeah.
Like there'd be a guy in Ohio worth more than Gina
just
Reinhardt.
all the people
right?
that, got the, who got money out of Walmart.
Yeah.
Like
there's just crazy amounts of money.
There's hundreds of them. And they could, really,
and they could just kill someone if they want. Like, that's the interesting. I mean, it's back to conspiracy theories. Like, that's the thing I always find interesting about stuff like Epstein and things like that. Like, if you have enough money, you don't get into those problems.
No.
Like, there's a point where it's either you can just kill someone and make it look like an accident, or you can just pay him off.
Yeah.
Like, the most telling thing about the Epstein case that made me think there was something else going on is the fact that the victims claim they were paid like $20.
Yeah.
Right? I know guys who are property developers in Western Sydney who are paying sex workers like 10 grand for a weekend, right? And you think, hang on, this guy's like meant to be grooming 16-year-old girls and he's paying $20? There's something not right about that. Because either you're going to pay him nothing and kill him, or you're going to pay him $1 million so you never see him again.
Never see him again.
Right? That's what real wealth is. Like, it's paying that kind of money and not caring about it.
You touched on MI6 before, and I just want to, because you've had a little bit to do with the National Anti-Corruption
recently, yeah.
But I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, I'm prohibited by law from talking about it.
Okay,
unfortunately.
good. But like, one thing I'm determined to ask you: how good are Australian spooks?
I think they're shit.
Are they
man.
shit?
I think they're absolutely shit.
We hear about like Mossad being fantastic spooks.
Okay, I get on that.
And like with the pages and the charges thing, and then and then knocking off the.
I'm going to get into that. I got to duck to the gents really quick because I'm on a diuretic right now.
Okay, no worries. We'll have a break and then we'll talk about spooks.
I will get into that. Man.
All right,
I have a lot.
And then we'll wrap up, mate. We won't go.
Yeah.
So I just want to bring you back to something you said then, John. Australia's spooks, our spies. ASIO, ASIS. Is ASIS still around?
I think that's still ASIS. Yeah.
ASIS. Are our spooks any good? And who are the best spooks in the world?
They suck. Australia's spooks suck. One of the worst things I think has happened in Australia in the last 20 years in the intelligence community was in 2019, we were finally at the point where the government was starting to recognise the threat of foreign influence seriously. We had the fallout from that whole Sam Dastyari fiasco. Huang Zhimao was a household name. He was being investigated by the ICAC. We had Ernest Wong, Shaket Masulmani, the Jamie Clements bags of cash thing. The linchpin for that and the network of Chinese foreign influence was Huang Zhimao. And in 2019, Australia's intelligence community decided it was a good idea, while he had a warrant out for his arrest by the ICAC, so he could give evidence, to deport him. And so he was kicked out of the country. He's kicking up his heels in Shanghai in his multi-million-dollar mansion. And we never got to find out what the hell went on. And that's just one example of how these guys operate. It's like they're not serious about getting to the bottom of foreign interference. I mean, it's a much bigger issue than just that. I mean, now we have foreign interference from not just China, but India, the United States, Israel, Iran, Qatar, everyone involved in the current kind of troubles in the streets, etc. But just on the original China thing, like the patient zero for it was unceremoniously kicked out of the country when we had an opportunity to publicly demand answers from him. And we just kicked him out. And it makes it look like these guys are covering for something. It makes it look like these guys, don't want people arrested, don't want people in prison. I mean, what have they done recently, right?
Well, I can't recall anything other than that. Like, I really don't.
Okay, so very recently, only in the last 6 months,
But is that a function that they're doing their job well, or is that a function that they're doing their job badly?
This is one of the ways they manipulate people, right? And I remember when I first started out in politics, you would hear this all the time, like, oh, well, it's good when they're not doing anything. You don't want to hear about them because it means they're working. Bullshit. Like, when they're doing stuff because guys go to prison.
Yep.
Right? Now, recently, they apprehended 2 Russian spies, the 2 Australian Defence Force members who had infiltrated the Defence Force and were stealing secrets and selling them to Russia. I mean, well, they weren't even really selling them. They were just contacting the Russian authorities to exchange them. Now, they got arrested, but that's at a very low level. That's like probably the only one they've had in the last decade or more. It seems to me like they're stuck in this war on terror era mindset where the big issue is, Al-Qaeda under the bed or right-wing extremism or left-wing extremism. The real threat has been and always is state-level actors manipulating the Australian government, which they just seem to be able to do now with impunity, right, at every level. I mean, ironically enough, the United States has had the most influence on us over the decades, probably not doing that much right now. The big issue right now is China, India, and Israel. Those are the 3 countries that seem to have the most undue influence over the Australian government. And we're seeing nothing from our spy agencies about agents of influence at every level of the Australian government, influencing our politicians, influencing business. Like, it's across the board, and they do nothing about it. So on that level, yeah, I think they're really bad. Who are the best? I mean, it's one country that I think we don't give enough credit to is Indonesia, right? Our nearest neighbor and one of the countries that should be one of our best friends shut down Jemaah Islamiyah, won their own war on terror 10 years before we did, right? And if anything, they're the ones that we should be taking advice from because they obviously know how to deal with these issues internally. But yeah, I think there's a huge reform piece for any serious government on how the Australian intelligence community works, because there's just been a string of things that raise questions. Some of the stuff on the Ben Roberts-Smith thing, like on the war crimes in Afghanistan, there were elements of that were extremely eyebrow-raising, right? Like not just the fact that the guys were over there committing war crimes, but the fact that they got back and it seemed like some kind of clandestine operation was continuing. I mean, who was supporting that? Who was paying for that? I mean, we don't have the answers to. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of questions to be raised about the efficacy of Australia's intelligence regime.
But right now, you think that foreign influence is rife in Australia?
It's rife.
Absolutely.
It is absolutely rife at all levels. And
I know Clive Hamilton. He wrote a book about about the influence of the CCP on all levels of Australian government and through business, and using like soft influence too. Not like torturing people or blackmailing people, but just picking candidates of choice and supporting them.
We're just considered an easy mark,
right?
Because we don't seem to do anything about it. Like in the United States,
slap on the wrist, deport you back home. But in the States,
they disappear people over this stuff, right? Like
you'd be in a federal penitentiary in Terre Haute
Australia,
for 30 years.
There's zero consequences. In fact, there's only profit upside for anyone involved in it. I mean, Sam Dastyari's still a lobbyist. He's still working. There were no consequences for what he did. He took money from a Chinese agent of influence and then promoted his views live on television, and there have been zero consequences for it, right? Zero consequences for the guys at Sussex Street who are hoovering money out of the United Workfront for the better part of 5 years. They were making money out of those guys. Right, there's been zero consequences for anyone who's involved in the push by Modi for, you see Albanese cuddling up to the Indian community and the Indian government every day. These people are spying on us. We've busted them spying on us, right? No consequences at all. Russia's in an alliance with Brazil, Russia, Iran, and China, trying to create a new currency even. And we have zero consequences.
What's that called again?
BRICS.
BRICS.
Yeah. There's zero consequences. And our politicians, I mean, look, Barry O'Farrell went over there. Like at the end of his, when he got done over the bottle of wine, right?
Yeah.
Barry's on a plane to India the next day, has been shilling for Indian interests in Australia ever since. And he's not the only one. Right? I mean, China got a bit spicy for a while, but India didn't. You can still do that.
What about overseas? Like, do we do like any effective work in other countries? Like, if we're not even doing the work,
I don't think so. It's clear that we don't. I mean, the only evidence of us ever doing that is with East Timor. Yeah. And we got busted for that. And then so like that's how bad the Australian intelligence regime is. The one and only time we ever had to spy on anyone was the East Timorese government, and we got caught by the East Timorese. Like, I don't think they even had phones when we bugged them, and I don't know, there's this culture of the, people think, oh, well, you don't know the real story with intelligence. Like, well, you generally do. Like, they generally have to come clean about it at some point.
Yeah, but ipso facto, like after the fact, you've won the, you've revealed something, or you've won, you've nipped something in the bud, or you've at the end you're saying, hey, like there's an outcome. This guy's, being prosecuted or deported at least.
And something has definitely gone wrong with the intelligence community's culture in Australia. Like it's not a really good book, but it's a book. David Marr and Marion Wilkinson wrote a book years ago called Dark Victory about children overboard and everything that was going on behind the scenes with Howard. There's a great anecdote in that about how Howard had asked Nick Warner from ACES to go to Indonesia and set fire to all the people smuggler boats.
Yeah.
Like they were going to do this like secret operation to just burn the people smuggler boats down. Like you don't see stuff like that happening anymore, right? Like we just have a culture of doing nothing, allowing things to happen to us.
Speaking of having things done to you, what the fuck is Pine Gap? Now, come on, tell us. Here. What is it? Because I saw, what was it? Jordan Shanks went out there and did this spoof thing and went out there what's going on with Pine Gap?
I think it's just part of their,
it's just like Five Eyes. It's
just, if you go back to when Snowden came out and released all his NSA documents, right? Like, I think it's just their Southern Hemisphere listening station. Yeah. That's it. So all the traffic, all the internet traffic that comes globally through the Southern Hemisphere, I think they're just listening to.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's interesting. I don't think it's actually that important really, because they've got other listening stations in the Northern Hemisphere. Like they've definitely got one in Greenland. Like that's why Trump so desperately wants to get his hands on the whole country, because it's such a strategically important place. But
especially as the permafrost recedes, and you can probably throw a lot of gas.
If you want to read every email out of
Pine Gap, like Jordan Shanks, he's just like it can't be that serious.
I don't think it is.
He can just walk up and through the bushes.
I don't think it is that serious. I've actually walked up to the gates of Area 51 a few years ago. Yeah, it's on my Facebook. When I was traveling through the US, Me and a buddy were driving because we were going to drive from Las Vegas to Utah, and I said, "No, we've got to take this detour. I want to go see Groom Lake," because I think we drove out and we saw the Trinity test site, which is like a bit of a tourist trap. You can actually stand under where the bomb went off, which is pretty cool.
You know, you used to be able to do it. Like people used to in Vegas stand on hotels to watch them.
Yeah.
Like,
You
it's like
could see them.
You could just, you're having your dirty martini and your black tie.
Yeah, you could actually see them.
And just watch them.
So you can go to Death Valley in the Trinity test site and actually stand under where the bomb dropped, which is cool because I've personally stood at the locations of almost all the world's worst nuclear disasters.
Hiroshima?
So I've been to Hiroshima.
Yes,
I haven't been to Nagasaki. I've been to Chernobyl. I never to the not Long Island.
3 Mile.
3 Mile. I haven't been to 3 Mile, but yeah, I've been to the Trinity test site as well. So I really want to go before I die. I want to go to Bikini Atoll and just sit on the beach at Bikini Atoll and drink a martini because that's probably the most notorious one after the United States.
I love watching that. There's that. It's a GIF or whatever it is. It's like the short video of just fucking gargantuan tidal wave from that. And they've got all the decommissioned destroyers and cruisers and whatever. They're just going, what if we let one off in the ocean?
Yeah,
and there's just this wave that just consumes
the other
boats
reason
at Marshall Islands or
supposedly
Bikini.
the other reason they like letting them off in the ocean is because they could test the efficacy of them without revealing how big they were. That's, I mean, you were in Tasmania as a kid the same time I was, right? Like, so that's one of the explanations for why we all have thyroid problems. You ever hear this?
No.
So supposedly the Israelis and South Africa let one off the coast, well, not off the coast of Tasmania, but like a long way away, but like in the direct path of Tasmania.
The Roaring 40s.
Back in the 1970s.
Yeah, right.
Is that there was actually a South African-Israeli nuclear test.
I've heard the same thing.
That blew across Tasmania.
I've heard the same thing about Maralinga, that they did a airborne plutonium test. So what they did was let plutonium go, or like basically the shit art that you would get after a nuclear explosion, like, fucking radioactive, fallout. They let that go. They did like an air release of that at like an altitude with the prevailing wind, and they were testing and went out and saw how many kangaroos died. But it blew all the way across Australia and led to this massive cancer cluster in the central west of New South Wales of breast cancer. I've heard that one.
Have you heard the Omsharonko one?
No. Hit me.
Okay, this one's wild, right? So you know where the Woomera test site is, right? So in the late 1980s, Omsharonko, the apocalyptic Japanese death cult, started like a franchise here in Australia. They bought land out there, out past Woomera, and supposedly were buying up chemicals trying to test what would eventually become their sarin gas.
No way.
But the theory is they were trying to build an atomic bomb.
No way.
And there's been like incidents with former Omsharonko members have shown signs of radiation poisoning and neurological issues associated with contact with radiation. Like, it's pretty crazy. I'll send you some links. That's a really good,
that is a deep
homegrown conspiracy theory that, Omsharonko were trying to build a nuclear bomb here in Australia.
I heard an interview with a guy, and his job was to the bulldozer driver at the Woomera test site, and he had to just build the road for when they were firing rockets out of Woomera. He had to build the road so they could drive out and, test, like to pick up the rocket and see what it looked like or see how big the explosion was. But it was like some 4,000 mile long road from Woomera.
Because it's the middle of nowhere. There's nothing out there.
And he was literally doing it for like 15 years.
Yeah.
Just bulldozing this road into the middle of nowhere.
To this day, we have no idea what they were doing out there. The only things we know about it were declassified by the British and by Paul Keating when he went on a bit of a pogrom on it in the early 1990s. Like, other than that, no one has any idea what the hell they were really doing out there. Like, could have been anything.
Well, nukes have always, as I was saying before, have always piqued my interest. I just remember, I can't remember the class of sub it was, but I used to live on the, the Derwent River. like Sandy Bay, Taroona.
Yeah.
And I remember one time I was really stoned and I was sitting up on this hill with some mates in the car and we were just pulling billies in the HQ, looked out and there's this square black box in the middle of the river.
Oh, yeah, they used to come in there.
And I was just like, what the fuck's that? And everyone's going, what is that? And I'm going, am I seeing things? What's this fucking black box? And it wasn't moving. And then it just started to move. We were really peaking. And then it just came up, the nuclear sub. And we were like, oh my fucking God. Like, talk about a stealth weapon. Dude, clearly the most deadly platform.
If you want to get into
world.
like Australian conspiracy theories, right? Tasmania is conspiracy theory central.
What about the opium?
The poppies up there, right? But so Tasmania had, and actually still has, like more military land per ratio of the population than anywhere else in Australia, right? So if you think about here in New South Wales, so what do we got like base-wise, right? We've got like Watsons Bay, Williamtown,
Jervis
Richmond.
Bay,
Like you think about it
Holsworth.
per ratio of the population, right? Where everyone lives. Down in Tasmania, it's something like 25% of Crown land is reserved for the Defence Force.
Yeah, there's Brighton and there's this huge like,
Anglesey. I was an Air Force cadet when I was a kid. Anglesey Barracks is massive.
Yeah,
it's like
huge.
a labyrinth in there.
Yeah.
It is a huge Defence Force establishment. And, they spend more money on recruiting Tasmanians than anywhere else.
Really?
Like when I was turning 17, 18 in Tasmania in like 2001, I mean, that was when the push was on. Like I knew dozens of guys who joined up because it was like on every street corner. They were trying to like get guys into the military.
Yeah, I know a couple of guys that ended up in Afghanistan.
Yeah, a lot of Tasmanians joined up. There's a huge Defence Force community down there. And just like the amount of stuff they have, that like there's an artillery range down there that's bigger than some Sydney suburbs up on the north coast.
Yeah, there's like Paddington, but Anglesey I think is one of the oldest army bases in Australia. And it's really massive, man. Like, and it was like established on like pretty much day one, wasn't it? Like it's like 1805.
It's been down there the whole time. Well, people forget that Tasmania was, in terms of like the global economy in the late 1800s, Tasmania had a larger economy proportionally than New South Wales because we had whaling. Right? So Tasmania was hugely influential. It was a massive strategic choke point for the British. That's why, like where you were talking about, like down in Taroona, Sandy Bay, well, you've got all the old pillboxes down there.
Yeah.
Like they had defensive emplacements on either side of the Derwent.
Yeah, Tinderbox had that huge battery
to
down
defend
there.
against the Russians, I think it was, in the
like
late 1800s.
Yeah.
So it's always been a weird place like that. Like there's a lot of weird shit that goes on.
The conspiracy theory that I don't know if you ever heard this, was that the opium that came out, I don't know how the opium got out of Tassie. So the alkaloid industry, massive in Tasmania, it's waned a bit, but they were what was that compound that they were making, that thebaine or whatever it was, that was sort of a workaround from importing, so that they had that the chemists came up with the sort of the sort of proxy for opium, that workaround that led to OxyContin and all the rest of it. All coming out of Tasmania, one of the largest
biggest in the world right now.
In the world, biggest.
If you get on a morphine drip anywhere in the world, chances are it is a Tasmanian poppies going in your bloodstream.
Yeah, it's pretty wild down there. But I heard that the opium got to Tassie, out of Tassie to the States on a US nuclear submarine.
That would not surprise me.
Or at least it had it basically had an escort of an aircraft carrier or a nuclear sub, because if the Yanks don't get their drugs, it's fucking civil war. Have you ever heard that?
I've heard something similar that, like, so have you ever, because you work here on Macquarie Street, right? So have you ever seen the RBA bond trucks?
No.
So it only happens, I think, about 3 or 4 times a year, and it's like Blackwater guys, like private military contractors in like the Bearcat trucks, pull up at like 4 a.m. in the morning and they put the physical bonds in them to do the cannonball run out to Bankstown Airport.
No way.
And they take them out to the airport and then they fly them off. So these are like Australia's bond products that are still paper held. And there's still like, if you look at Australian national accounts, like we still have, hundreds of millions of dollars in paper bonds that we buy and then get traveled around the world. So once every few months, our bond sales happen and they put them in the trucks and take them out. And they have them under like these guys with machine guns and stuff standing at the top of the trucks. I saw them do it for the vaccines during COVID. I think it was Liverpool Hospital was like the disembarkation point for all the early AstraZeneca vaccines that were being brought in. And they were closing down streets and had like a military motorcade to bring them through. So it still happens.
The only thing like that I've seen was I saw when Netanyahu came out.
Oh, yeah, that was wild.
That was wild.
That was
when
wild.
they shut down Sydney,
Yeah.
and there was just like a Black Hawk or a couple of Black Hawk helicopters or fucking Apaches. I don't know what they were, but they were just hovering above the Intercontinental. There was snipers everywhere, and they just had like cops with.
Well, there's an interesting conspiracy theory that you hear over the years if you work in Macquarie Street, right? Which is what happened at the 2003 New Year's Eve ceremony, right? So 2003 New Year's Eve was supposedly insane here in Sydney, and the journos refused to report on it, but something happened. And they put Black Hawks up, like the city locked down. You couldn't get out for New Year's. Like there were all the fast boats out in the water. Something happened in 2003 New Year's Eve that they have never spoken about ever since.
Like someone got into a vault or something.
Something went on. Like a lot of people, I've heard it like from pretty credible people say, there was a serious attempted terrorist attack on 2003 on New Year's Eve on the waterfront, and whatever they did, they just locked the whole thing down, which we had the power to do at the time. Because you remember, like Howard passed all those crazy laws, like you could lock someone up for 14 days with no trial,
no lawyer,
suppress everything,
and you could never ever tell anyone.
Never tell anyone ever again. Like, I've spoken to a lot of people who say that something happened that night that they'll never admit to. I'm looking forward to 2033 cabinet and confidence will be out. You might be able to find out about it in like 5 or 6 years.
Well, there's a lot of good stuff there, John. Look, I really appreciate you coming on and putting your points of view, which are always fascinating, always interesting. You're always really well informed. And I think it's really important, in a podcast that talks about culture, politics, current events, to get the broad spectrum, mate. And you are on the spectrum, mate.
I am definitely on the spectrum,
If you want anyone in the world to guide you through spooks, to get you in and out of the ninth circle of hell, it's Thanks, John Macgowan. If ever I'm north of the wall, you're the guy I want with me. And I'm looking forward to the federal election and getting you back on for your takes on that. So thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks, brother. Cheers.
Good on you, John.